G'day mates, it's B-Buster here, and I would like to give Best Fiends a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. And you know, one of my favourite guilty pleasures is just kicking back and binging through a good crime series on Netflix. Criminal Minds was my latest one, and man was it good. But one thing I feel exactly zero guilt about is how much I enjoy playing Best Fiends. Best Fiends gives me an endless source of fun that I can access anytime right on my phone. It's a match 3 puzzle game like none other, with literally thousands of levels and new content added all the time. I've been playing for a while now, and I'm a little obsessed, to be honest. Oh, maybe a lot obsessed. I've really enjoyed some of the latest levels and puzzles though, especially some of the boss levels, and I've been playing it at night in bed when I can't sleep. It really helps to just take my mind off of things and to relax a bit. I think I've been playing it casually for maybe a year now too, and I'm a little over 900 levels in, and I'm still finding new elements to the game. And I think that's what I really love about Best Fiends the most. Yes, it's a fantastic boredom quencher, it's great for casual gameplay and moments of downtime throughout the day, but I also love that more levels, events, challenges are always being added, so the game never really runs out of things to do. It's also free to download, and seriously, once you download Best Fiends, boredom won't stand a chance. So, download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. Man, it makes me cringe realizing just how long ago this was. Nearly 25 years ago when I was in my early 20s. I was sharing a house with a couple of guys. We were all in the same religious order. It was a great house to live in because we kept a tidy house and a roster for housework and cooking duties. But I digress. So, me and one of the other guys had a day off, and I suggested that we go for a hike to a place that I visited every few months or so. It was a big granite outcrop in the middle of Victoria, southeastern Australia. There was a lookout at one outcrop, the lower one, that had a car park and a well-formed path to the top. And there was a dirt road that went for about 3 kilometres between that outcrop and the bigger, higher one. The dirt road curves around, but I used to like to walk through the bush between the 2 outcrops and climb the bigger one. These outcrops had a lot of huge granite boulders, some the size of a house even. You can climb some of them and jump from one to another like a big natural kids' playground almost. But anyway, we parked and walked up to the lookout. Nothing unusual. There wasn't anyone else around or any other cars, but this is not totally unusual for a weekday out there. We looked around at the surrounding countryside and after a few minutes walked back down the path and passed the cart across to the other outcrop. At that point, we both saw a man coming up the road, but he had 4 legs and 4 arms, it looked like. Not like they were naturally growing out of his torso, but like a video processing a glitch, where the 2 parts of the picture were doubled and sort of out of sync, one covering the other about a third overlapping. It took a few seconds for us to actually work out what we were seeing, sort of like your brain trying to make sense of what you're looking at. I kept looking and trying to work out what was wrong with what I was seeing. I could tell by how my friend was acting too that he also saw something wrong. After maybe about probably 10 seconds, no, it felt a lot longer, we realized what we were seeing was actually what we were seeing. And at that, we both started walking really quickly the other way. We were headed back to the lookout, but the car was just 50 meters away. We started going back up the track again and then both stopped and thought, what are we doing? We need to just get back in the car, right? I could see the man getting closer, but he was still a ways off. We jumped in the car as quickly as we could, and I spun it around and got the heck out of there. Another weird thing about this guy, though, was that he was wearing a yellow tan top, maybe a jacket, and a turquoise pants. A really weird combination for where we lived. I didn't have to ask my friend, did you see that, because it was obvious that he had. And as we calmed down, we kept saying, what the heck was that? I don't know what that was, but man, I'm glad we got out of there. We eventually got to the next town, and We bought some lunch and a drink, and we didn't talk about it to anyone or each other really ever again. However, now having heard some stories here, I often wonder if he saw exactly what I saw too, or if he saw something equally weird, but different. So about 15 years ago, I was living with my ex-girlfriend and my sister and her husband in an old house not far from town. Within the first few weeks of living there, strange things were happening regularly. Lights going out randomly, noises upstairs. At one point, one of the windows at the back of the house was cut, like someone went at it with a glass cutter trying to break in but gave up on it and left. Just really creepy stuff like that. That was bad enough, but things got pretty severe as time went on, and one week in particular was just absolutely crazy. The first thing that happened that week was one Tuesday night. Everyone was working and I was home alone watching TV when I noticed our cat was acting really weird. It backed into a corner and arched up like it was scared. When I went to get up, the electricity went out in the house and it was pitch black inside. And the second that happened, I heard really loud footsteps running down the stairs, straight at me. I got up and braced myself for whatever it was, but when I did, there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, and then eventually gathered myself and went outside to the front garden to check if other houses' lights were on, but my house was the only one that was dark. I went to the fuse box and reset the trip switch, and all was back to normal. A few days later, I think it was a Thursday, we were all in the sitting room watching a movie with pizza and lights on and good atmosphere in the house when, out of nowhere, a massive bang happens upstairs. We go up to check it out, and I went into our bedroom and saw my bedside table was now in the middle of the room. Mind you, this bedside table was really heavy, so there's no way that it could move by itself. But the worst and last thing that happened to me was on a Saturday night, and I will never forget this. It still gives me chills when I even think about it. We go to bed, everything's normal, watch a bit of a movie and fall asleep. I wake up facing the wall and glance at the alarm clock. It read 3:13. I turn over to go back to sleep and I see my ex standing in the middle of the room. Confused, I begin to sit up to ask her what's up, but as I start to sit up, I realize that my ex is actually asleep in the bed next to me. Instantly, a surge of fear runs through me and I'm frozen to the spot. My eyes adjust and I barely make out the figure now, but it's a young girl in a nightdress with a cartoon character on it, soaking wet with her head down looking at the floor. I can even hear the water drop onto the carpet, and I'm just sitting there, just completely in shock. Couldn't believe my eyes. After a couple of seconds, though, it just kind of melts away, like fades out of sight. I got up and turned on the lights, rubbed my eyes, and tried to tell myself that it must have been a night terror or something, but the problem with that was that there was water on the floor, a wet patch where she was standing. And it wasn't long after that I moved out. I can still picture her to this day, though, and it was the creepiest thing that I've ever experienced. I grew up in a small town in Nova Scotia, very rural, and one night a group of us, 6 or so, were walking around town at night. I would have been about 15, 16 years old at the time, so about maybe 11 or 12 years ago. Now, there's a graveyard there that you have to get by walking down a very long wooded path. It opens up into an open, sort of hilly area with no houses nearby at the end, surrounded by trees. We were all just sort of messing around in the graveyard, doing the usual stuff that we try to spook each other out and see if we can see anything spooky. But we'd been there for probably about 45 minutes and got burned out on the spook factor, so we were just gabbing away when my friend Jay pointed out that a light was moving weird in the sky. But we looked up and, yeah, a distinct light was moving across the sky. But then it would make like 90-degree turns on a dime. No curving into it or anything. Just bam, right-hand turn. We were sort of debating what it could be too, when all of a sudden it just exploded into a fireball. But there was no sound, which was weird. And when that happened, the whole lighting outside changed just by a little bit. Imagine there was a dimmer outside for starlight. Well, it was as if the entire ambient light changed for like a split second. It wasn't like it lit up from the explosion too, but as soon as that happened, all of us looked at each other and broke into a sprint. We didn't need to say anything, we all just sensed something was really weird. We ran through the graveyard though and down the long wooded pathway. My friend C and I were at the back of the group and slowed to walk once we started getting near the end. Everyone was just talking ahead about what the heck that we just saw. As C and I are talking though, we then hear sticks breaking to our left. Instantly I looked over and say, "What the heck is that?" And there's what looks like a completely naked, sort of thin child or something lurching through the woods, approximately 10 feet from us, but its skin was so white that it almost looked like it was glowing. I don't think it was, but it sort of looked like that. It was just kind of slowly lurching in our direction, moving through the sticks. Well, we immediately ran, yelling, "There's something in the woods here," but I wanted to be sure because, I thought that I was going to regret it if I didn't double check. So I backtracked a little bit just to confirm that I was seeing what I thought I was. And yeah, it was just that. A naked, pale, sort of humanoid thing walking slowly through the woods. We ran away again to the end of the pathway, and only one other friend had seen what we saw, but not as close as us. The time between the explosion in the sky and the thing in the woods was probably no more than like 2 minutes at the most. 4 years ago, though, I messaged my friend that I was walking with that night. We don't really hang out or talk that much anymore, just to see if our memories were the same, and yeah, he confirmed everything. I'm 27 now, and even with my skeptical about everything sort of attitude, I really just don't know how to explain this one. I'm not sure if the thing in the sky was related to the thing in the woods, but I can only assume so, right? It was a very weird experience, but another interesting bit of info is that the small area that I grew up in is home to a UFO incident, Shag Harbor UFO incident. And in the wiki info it states that a pilot was being followed by a craft and it exploded but made no sound, which was very similar to what we saw, and very interesting for sure. So it was a beautiful Friday, and I was still somewhat fresh into my relationship with the love of my life. I had a week earlier decided to finally quit the nasty substances in my life, and had made it one whole week without using. How did my addict mind know how to celebrate? Well, get another bag, of course. We were spending the day hiking through the beautiful wooded areas. What I didn't predict was just how far down my tolerance had gone, and I was getting progressively naughty, but wrote it off to my girl as just being sick. As the night began to wind down, we decided to get a fire going on this very remote hilltop, way out in the sticks, to just sit back and watch the stars. But while we're chilling there, we notice a car pull up, and while we were a little curious, it wasn't like it's private land or anything. We continue talking and cuddling up next to our fire, thinking maybe it's just some kids getting high or whatever. Next thing I know, I see this man appear out of the dark on the path. He's walking along looking like maybe he's going to a lookout area to watch some stars too. But as he passes, I greet him with a, "Hey, how's it going?" And the guy literally just stares at us without saying a word in return and walks past. But the look on his face, though, was just borderline evil. No expression, just deadpan. It was very odd, but I'm a tough guy, so I'm not too worried. He walks past a bit later, It's a one-way in and out deal sort of thing, and gets into his truck to drive off. Or so he thought. Now, remember, I'm pretty faded and the nods are getting me bad at this point. I'm going in and out of some dream world and was speaking out loud what I was experiencing in this said dream world, aka pretty high. My girl starts to hear something rustling around in the trees and tries to alert me, but I'm just too faded at first to get what she's saying. But eventually she gets my attention, and as soon as I heard it, my adrenaline made me go from dopey to high alert. Now, I grew up in the woods, and I know how animals act and how they move and stuff. And this clearly was not an animal. It was making way too much noise, and when I tried to yell to scare it off, it would stop moving for a second. It felt like it was getting closer and closer, though, to the point where I grabbed a big log and began screaming at the woods, "Come on then, I know you're in there." And as I said that, whoever it was in there ran wildly, crashing through branches as they went. We decided at that point that it was best to just get out of there, so we packed up and walked out, log in hand for protection. And what we saw as we went out still freaks me out. So we saw that guy's same truck pulled down the road, a ways into some trees. That creepy guy, whoever he was, tried to hide his truck to come and stalk us, and he was still out there somewhere, perhaps even watching as we were leaving. Needless to say, I was beyond freaked out at this point. We ran our butts out of there, and we didn't feel safe until we got home. When I think back on it, I really hope that he was just thinking that he had a peek of some potential action, but with how far out we were, anything could have happened. This was a major wake-up call for me, though, and I was incapacitated and unable to protect the fullest love of my life, and from there out, I had a few relapses, but that was the beginning of the end for me. For reference, too, I haven't touched anything in over a decade. So to preface this story, I'm a paramedic and I have been for about 10 years. Working in emergency medicine, you get to see the weirdest and the worst of people, so it's not too uncommon for these types of stories to exist. However, in my 10 years, I have never experienced pure terror incarnate like I had about 6 years ago. I won't be revealing specific or identifying details as it pertains to privacy and HIPAA. This may be a bit long too, but I hope it's worth the listen. So, about 6 years ago, I moved to another city for work. I worked for a 911 ambulance service that responded to calls in the city, as well as the country, which had a few other small towns. The city itself was not a large city, sub 100,000 people, I would say. Working for that service required working 24-hour shifts, though. It wasn't particularly busy. Maybe you'd get 5 to 10 calls in 24 hours and generally get some decent sleep at night. This city was a pretty rough place as the oil industry had boomed there, which drew all sorts of folks from around the country to work in the oil fields nearby. But one night in January, me and my partner, who was an EMT basic, received a call in the next town over. It was about 2 a.m. when the call came out, and the only information that we had was that a person in an apartment called 911 after hearing the downstairs neighbors screaming for help. We responded emergent, as the details were very limited. When we arrived on scene, the police and the fire department were already there, and we were getting ready to make entrance into the building with them. The person who called 911 was there and told us which apartment she'd heard the screaming from. We attempted to pound on the door at first to get the resident to come to the door. When no one answered, the fire department got ready to spread the door and make entry. Luckily, though, the landlord showed up and he gave us a key to get into the unit. And as we opened that door, the creepiness started. The apartment was pitch black, not a single light, as if no one was home. The police entered first, and with our flashlights we followed. Looking around the apartment, the kitchen and the dining room looked like a hoarder's nest. I'm not exaggerating too when I say that there were literally 5-foot-tall mountains of garbage, food, dishes in the kitchen, and the same in the living room, but with magazines and clothes and garbage just everywhere. and this meant that there was only a very narrow walkway to navigate this apartment. Officers proceeded down the hallway ahead where the bedroom and the bathroom were. One of the officers stopped at the bathroom door as there was a light shining from underneath. The officer opened the door and just stood in the hallway, and with a flat tone he said, "She's in here." I walk in first into the bathroom, and the first thing that I notice is the peculiarity of the light in the bathroom. It's a very pale yellow light, coming from a single bulb on the ceiling, similar to those old heat lamps that used to be common in bathrooms. The light gave off a really odd vibe as it was just so unnatural. But the next thing I notice is the lack of anything in the bathroom. No floor mats, no toilet cover, no towels, no knickknacks, just nothing. Empty, in fact. Except the vanity which contained the sink. On top and in the bowl of the sink were approximately 20 to 30 makeup bottles piled up. Some were opened and leaking, causing there to be powders and liquids everywhere. And the last thing that I noticed was the body of an elderly woman lying naked in the tub. As I walk closer, I can see her lying on her side, nearly in the fetal position. Her skin is pale, and there's about 8 inches of water in the tub. Looking at her face, her eyes were closed, and her head is against the bottom of the tub with her mouth and nose completely submerged under the water. My partner steps in behind me. He suggests that we call the coroner and inform them of the body. 2 officers pile into the bathroom behind my partner, so there's 4 of us up in this tiny bathroom with me next to this lady in the tub. And with me being who I am, I decide to do my due diligence and at least make sure the lady is dead. So I kneel down next to the tub and reach my arm in and put my fingers on her neck, attempting to check for a pulse. And in an instant, without warning or the slightest hint of movement, this woman springs up out of the tub with the agility and speed of like a feral cat. The only reaction I was able to manage was just to stand up as quick as possible, and I just stood there staring at her. She stared back at me, eyes wide as can be, before she started just screaming at me. She attempted to cover herself with her hands as best as she could while still sitting in the water. I quickly look around and notice that everyone else who was in the bathroom with me has bolted out of there, not a single soul in sight. I try to steel myself and try calming the lady down, telling her who I was and why I was there. She denied screaming and told me that she does this every morning as she had some kind of joint condition and soaking in warm water helps ease her joint pain. Now, at this point, I have my doubts and I have to question this woman's sanity for sure. So I question her regarding self-harm and address what potentially could be interpreted as suicidal behavior. She denies all of it though, and the next step is to determine her mental capacity to ensure that she's in the right frame of mind and to make reasonable and appropriate decisions. She answers all of my other questions appropriately, and at this point, per the law, she's able to refuse any and all care as she's mentally sound. I do ask her if she'll at least let me check her vitals so that I can be sure that she's healthy and I can add it to my report. She vehemently refuses though and tells me to get out of her house, which she has the right to. I acknowledge that and I have her sign a refusal of service form, and as I leave the bathroom, my partner, the 2 officers that were in the bathroom with me, along with the 2 other officers and firefighters that were waiting in the apartment, they're all just sort of staring at me with eyes wide and gaping mouths, speechless. In the end, I don't say a word and we all leave the apartment. Once we're all outside, though, I had the most uneasy and uncontrolled fit of laughter that I've ever had. My partner and the officers started laughing too, but I honestly thought that I may have even crapped myself. My partner told me later that all he remembers is seeing her move, hearing me say, "Oh crap," which I don't even remember, and running out of the bathroom. And you know, I wish that I could say that I never saw this lady again, but that would be untrue. So this one should be a bit shorter since you already have the backstory. But like I said, after this call I was just sort of able to laugh about it once my heart stopped racing. I figured that I would never have to see this lady again, and that gave me a lot of comfort. I told the story several times to family, friends, and co-workers, just because of the sheer shock value. But this part of the story I've only really told to a couple of people because most probably can't stomach it, so be warned, this will contain some pretty graphic content or imagery. So about 3 months after the first call with the bathtub lady, I'm working with another EMT basic partner, and not the same one as before, but he is well aware of the story. So the day is going by like normal, and nightfall comes. I'm hoping to get some sleep, as generally night is a little calmer. Each of our stations have a few bedrooms with twin beds to allow us to at least sleep somewhat comfortably. I take off my boots, and I lay down and doze. I always keep my radio turned way up and by my head, so I can wake up if we get a call. And sure enough, tones drop on the radio, and I wake up. Looking at the clock, it's around 4 a.m. Radio traffic requests the ambulance for a welfare check on an individual who hasn't been seen for a while. Me and my partner get up, put our boots on, and we start responding to the address. As we get closer, though, I start recognizing the area. And before I even see the building, I tell my partner, I swear to you that if this is the same lady, and he just laughs and we continue. As we pull up on the scene, yep, it's that same building. At this point, my heart starts to race again. A few officers are already on the scene. As I get out of the ambulance, one of the officers comes up and tells me, "Hey, the lady that we're here for has a friend that works at the gas station nearby here. The friend told 911 that the lady usually comes and visits him every day, but that the friend hasn't seen her in a few weeks." The officer also tells me that there's an odor coming from the apartment complex. Now, if you work in EMS or have been around such, you know what that means. And if not, I won't spoil it just yet. So I ask the officer if she's familiar with this person or has heard the story of the last encounter. The officer tells me that she's not, but her two co-workers behind her, they were actually on the original call with me and are smiling, but not saying a word. I tell the officer who the person is and our last run-in with her. The officer just raises her eyebrow a bit and says okay. So we approach the apartment complex yet again, and as I open the main door, you can immediately smell the odor permeating through the entire complex. We walk downstairs to the door of this lady's apartment. I bang on the door a few times and shout, "Ambulance." No response. Officers bang on the door. No response again. We try to get a hold of the landlord again to give us access, but he's unavailable. Over the radio, I request the fire department and request that they bring the door spreader. The fire department arrives and they come downstairs and set up the door spreader. If you don't know what a door spreader is, it's basically a tool that the fire department places between the two door jambs, and they use a lever to start pressing the door jambs apart, freeing the latch from the door frame so you can get in. As they finally get the door open, that awful wafting smell just spills out into the apartment. Same thing as last time, though. Pitch black in the apartment, piles of garbage all around the apartment 5 feet high that barely allow you to move through. Though, this time, it's a bit different, because there are thousands of flies buzzing around. Again, the officers enter first, with us following with our flashlights. One of the male officers gets down the hallway to the bathroom and opens the door. He looks back to me, shakes his head, and continues forward. My EMT partner, who is pretty new, is right behind me. I turn to him and tell him to wait in the hallway and that I'll let him know if I need him. I was trying to be nice and spare him. The officer continues down the hallway toward the bedroom. At this point, the anxiety is increasing because now we're in uncharted territory, and once again, I have no idea what we're going to find. The officer eventually makes it to the bedroom. I see him shine his light into the bedroom and then uses the bend of his elbow to cover his mouth and nose, and he waves me over. As I walk to him, the smell just gets stronger. I peer into the bedroom with my flashlight, and that was when I saw her. The bedroom is actually set up so that the bed is right in the middle of the room with the head pressed against the wall, so there's some space on either side and at the foot of the bed. Or at least there would be if the floors weren't filled up to the height of the bed with clothes and magazines and books and food and garbage and just everything you can imagine. At the foot of the bed are two large 4-foot-tall piles of just random crap that at the base are probably 4 feet in diameter. I know that it's hard to visualize this, but picture two large cone-shaped mounds side by side at the foot of the bed. And in the tiny space between the two huge mounds and the foot of the bed lies Bathtub Lady. Now, this lady is a very small old lady, and when I saw her the first time, she maybe weighed 90 pounds. She was also a white lady. But stunned for a moment, I stand there next to the officer and just sort of look. Because this is the part that gets, well, pretty gross. So Bathtub Lady is lying perfectly on her back with her arms folded up and crossed in front of her like you would see a skeleton doing in the movies. Bathtub Lady's skin looks almost like paper. It's dried out and shrunken, turning black and rotting. The level of decomposition from her is one that I hadn't seen before. Her hip bones were visible where the skin had cracked and receded. Her kneecaps were coming through her skin. A few ribs were just barely visible poking through the skin on the sides of her upper abdomen. And her hair was beginning to fall out. Her lips were gone, her eyes were gone. I got a bit closer to look, and all I kept thinking was, if you wake up, this officer is probably going to draw and shoot you in the head. I walked up a little closer to look nevertheless. She was almost perfectly preserved, like a mummy or something. There was absolutely nothing left of her eyes. The sockets were completely empty with the exception of maggots crawling around in the sockets. From behind me were a couple of quiet, muffled gags, and I walked back out to my partner. I tell him, hey, sorry man, but we need the body bag and I'm gonna need your help in here. And everyone walks outside to get some fresh air. The officer that was in the bathroom with me gagged a few more times outside, but luckily didn't vomit. The one good thing about this, though, is that we had recently been given these really nice PAPR respirators from FEMA for a recent Ebola outbreak. My partner grabbed the body bag and I grabbed the PAPRs. We put our gear on and we walked back inside. The officer that was with me, like a true champ, came back inside without a respirator as well and held the flashlight for us. Me and my partner had to spend 10 minutes just clearing out all of the trash so that we had enough room to put the body bag down next to the Bathtub Lady. Once we got enough room, the sketchy part came. If you've ever seen a body with that amount of decomposition, then you know that it's very brittle. We attempted to move her as carefully as we could as to not break anything. However, when we attempted to move her, she was stuck. And honestly, I just couldn't figure out what was going on. I was at the head, my partner was at the feet trying to move her over. I put my arms down her back and neck to support the head so that it didn't break off. I got down to look as we lifted, to see what we were getting stuck on. And as I lifted, I saw, but it was already too late. As I lifted, the skin on her back was stuck to the carpet. So as I lifted, it started peeling off her ribs and spine. We had no other choice, though, as we were unable to cut the carpet at this time. So as we lifted her up, all of the skin came off her back and stayed stuck to the floor, almost like some sort of sick chalk outline, which, when I saw it, what seemed to be like thousands of maggots crawling around on the inside of her skin, between the skin and her back, came pouring out. Well, we moved her gently into the bag, luckily not breaking anything. We got the bag out and into the ambulance, where we would then transport her to the funeral home with our windows rolled down and emergent, so we wouldn't have to stay in the ambulance as long as possible. So, that's my story of Bathtub Lady. And I'm sorry for the gross details, but it's all sort of part of the story. What we figured, though, is that she must have died shortly after our first encounter with her, and that we may have been the last ones to actually see her alive.
There was a period of about 3 years where my family took yearly vacations to a nearby state park. My dad bought this old RV from a buddy and we'd camp out in that. It was fun when I was younger, but that last year was miserable. I was almost 14 by then. Hanging out with my family was the last thing I wanted to do. It was spring break and all my friends were already going to places like Florida. I did anything I could think of to pass the time. I remember sleeping a lot and going on a lot of walks. I was bored to death sitting around camp waiting for bugs to bite me. I did meet a few girls my age, but they weren't able to hang out much. We'd been cramped up for 4 days when I ran into this cute older guy. He told me his name was Steve and he was 19. A group of his friends had invited him along for the holiday, but they all had to leave early. He'd been spending his days drinking beer and fishing. Being the deceitful and immature child that I was, I lied and told him that I was 17. When he asked if I wanted a beer, I accepted. I never even tasted beer at that age, but I wanted to look cool. We walked through a small clump of trees separating the 2 camping areas to his tent. He pulled out a can of beer from a cooler and handed it to me. It was so bad that I almost spit it back into his face, but I managed to choke it down. He and I sat at the picnic table and continued our discussion. Although I hated it, I kept drinking the beer. Halfway through the can, I kind of had a buzz going. Of course, at that time, I just knew that I felt really good. The taste began to improve with every sip, and I was drunk by the time I finished the first can. Steve had a fresh beer open and ready for me, and I started taking bigger and bigger drinks as the minutes passed. I was acting like a total idiot. I also began feeling very tired, and I laid my head down and listened while Steve talked, and I guess I must have fallen asleep. I remember raising my head up at one point and saw Steve standing a few feet away talking on his cell phone. I laid my head back down but soon woke up again, feeling sick. It wasn't long before I started throwing up. I was so embarrassed. I kept blaming it on food poisoning, and he was holding my hair back and laughing now. This probably took place over a period of hours but seemed like only minutes, and this is when things started to go south. I was finished puking and in the process of wiping it off my face when a car pulled into the camping spot. I assumed one of his friends had returned. It was starting to get dark and I knew my parents would start missing me. I'd left for a hike just after lunch, and now I was terribly embarrassed and just wanted to get away. In my mind, I was sober enough to get past my parents. Steve was at the car talking to another guy about his age, it seemed. I took my chance to slip away. I said goodbye and thanked him for the beers, and he called out to me to wait. He suggested I stay a little longer and have some water so I could sober up some more. He was walking toward me this entire time. I thanked him but said I needed to get back. I could hear my parents calling out for me through the trees at this point. I turned again and got about 3 steps before I felt someone grab me. It was Steve. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't say anything, and I quickly realized that he was dragging me to the car. The other guy had the trunk open and was looking around. I began fighting to get away, but Steve was so strong. The closer to the car I got, the more panicked I became. I could hear the other guy saying, "Hurry up," in a rushed tone. The fear really kicked in now, and I started screaming at the top of my lungs. Anything I could think of. Mommy, Daddy, help, anything. My parents were yelling back at me now. It all must have become too risky for Steve, and I heard him shout some expletive, and then he let me go. I just dropped onto the paved surface of the road, but expected I would soon be grabbed again. I balled up my fist preparing to fight, but when I turned, no one was there, and I sat up in time to see Steve jump into the passenger side of the car. The car sped off with the trunk still open, and a massive feeling of relief washed over me. Then, I emptied my stomach onto the pavement everywhere once more. My dad scooped me up like I was a feather and rushed me back to the camper. It took almost an hour for the sheriffs to arrive. They put out a bulletin or whatever it's called for the car, but it was little help. I knew nothing about cars and I was too busy fighting for my life to get the plate number. Despite my protests, I was taken to the hospital for tests. After I was cleared, we returned home and waited for news. and that would be the last family vacation we'd ever go on. Sleep was hard to come by for a long time. My parents put me in counseling, which did help a lot. It truly did. And the doctor gave me a prescription in case of anxiety attacks, but I didn't need to use it very often. The hardest part was dating. I had trouble being alone around men. The majority of times I went out in groups. Drinking was impossible. The risk of being drugged or taken advantage of was too high. I wouldn't drink alone with a man until my husband and I were married. I'd like to leave you all with an important message. Young women have so much pressure on them these days. It's not just about being pretty. They feel pressure to grow up faster than they need to. And this sometimes leads to poor decisions like the one I made. I'm not going to preach here. I realize you're going to do what you want. But if you do find yourself in a similar position, pay attention to your instincts. They rarely lead you wrong. When the time comes to leave, don't worry about hurting someone's feelings. Get out of there and get to safety. Anybody that doesn't understand doesn't deserve to be your friend. Somewhere about April or May every year, I leave the shop in the hands of my cousin and take a 2-week vacation in the Ozarks. Our family has a 250-acre piece of land that's used for hunting mostly. In my case, I just use it as a getaway from the stresses of modern life. The area has very little in the way of conveniences like electricity. One dirt and gravel road leads in and out. At the end of this road sits a 100-year-old log cabin, and this is where I spend my time. Just me, my thoughts, and the beauty of nature to keep me company. It's a routine I recommend to everyone. I could carry on about how beneficial nature is all day, but that's not why I'm here. I want to share a strange and terrifying incident I had back in 2020 while I was out there. While the rest of the world were hiding away in their homes, Mark, my cousin, and I were working our tails off. Things still needed repairing, and we were the only people in the area willing to fill the demand. Without our employees, we were overwhelmed in no time. When Mark injured his hand, we finally threw up our hands and shut down. The world was going to have to wait until we figured out a way around the lockdowns, and during this period of transition, I decided to take my vacation. A week or two in the woods was just what I needed. I was up late one night reading and heard a faint crack in the distance. It was familiar, but I was unable to place it. I sat quietly and waited for it to happen again, but I didn't hear it. I went back to my book, and the rest of the night was quiet. The next day, I found myself hiking away from the cabin and came across a dead deer. It clearly hadn't died from natural causes. The body had been hastily skinned and butchered. A lot of good meat had been wasted, and it made my blood boil. And not just because of the horrible harvesting. Any hunter reading this knows July is way out of hunting season. It appeared we had a poaching problem on our land. I snapped a few photos on my phone to send to the game warden when I got back to town. Nature would take care of what was left. The really strange stuff started later that afternoon. I was on the porch relaxing with a beer when a very odd feeling came over me. The woods around me had become very quiet. No birds were singing or anything. Slowly, I started to feel like I was being watched. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. The uneasiness began to weigh on me until I felt compelled to call out. No one moved or answered. This lasted for almost an hour. Gradually, the tension slowly lifted and the forest around me came back to life. It's an experience unlike any I've ever had. At dinner that night, I flipped through a book about Ozark wildlife we had on a shelf. My visitor had probably been a common deer, but black bear and mountain lions were also a possibility. The last two were said to be very rare in my neck of the woods. That being said, wildlife has its own set of rules and will go anywhere it pleases. I wasn't worried about the deer, but the others were very capable of killing me in a heartbeat. However, they also tend to be very shy of people. I had 3 days left of my stay. I figured if I kept my eyes peeled and stuck close to the cabin, I'd be relatively safe. And so that was my plan. Humans hadn't even crossed my mind despite just finding a kill the day before. As a rule, men are loud and easy to spot, and only a very seasoned woodsman can stay invisible in the forest. No matter the circumstances, I was determined to enjoy my remaining time, and I was up early the next day as usual. I'd had breakfast and was filling a bucket from the well when another crack came a second later, quickly followed by a ricocheting noise. That's when it clicked. I was being shot at. The noise was the sound of a suppressed rifle. I dove behind my truck, which was parked nearby. I was kicking myself for not recognizing it that first night. Even though silencers, as most of the world calls them, aren't super common, I do have friends that own them. They are used for hunting, but the practice is more common in Europe than here. Contrary to what the movies make you think, suppressors don't make your gun silent. Although they do drastically reduce the report of the gun, the actual action of the gun opening and closing makes a pretty loud clacking noise. None of that's important right now, though. Once I made it to cover, the shots stopped. I was unsure where they were coming from. I had no other choice but to try and escape some way. I was next to the truck, so that was the option I chose. As quietly as possible, I opened the driver's side door and crawled into the cab. I put the keys into the ignition and started the engine. I expected the shots to start again, but they didn't. I still wasn't willing to stick my head up and get it shut off. Luckily for me, I had a straight path to the road. I yanked the transmission into gear and pressed the gas pedal with my hand. The most I could do was hold the wheel straight and hope I didn't crash into a tree. It's not an easy way to drive, that's for sure. After I had gotten about 100 yards down the road, I quickly peeked over the dash. I didn't dare expose myself any longer than necessary. Any decent shot with a rifle could hit me at about 300 yards out without much trouble. I continued doing this until I was well out of range. At that point, I sat up into the seat and drove as fast as possible to the sheriff's station. When I arrived, I let them know that they had a crazed poacher sniper running loose. They were a lot calmer than I expected and far more prepared than I'd thought. The sheriff called in a nearby county to assist. They got together and planned out the operation quickly and in a very professional manner. I stood by a few miles away while they cleared the area. I was allowed in only after they were sure that he had fled. In my absence, he had shot the windows out of the cabin and there were several holes in the doors. I grabbed what I needed and returned home. It was all in the hands of law enforcement now. I was expecting a call within a few days updating me, but I heard nothing. After 2 weeks, I couldn't wait any longer. I contacted the sheriff and left a message. They called me back to say that they had yet to capture the subject, in those exact words. They had found signs of some old camps, but he hadn't been seen in almost a week. Missouri law enforcement has also been notified. They were monitoring their side of the border in case he crossed over into their state, and that was the last time I had any real information. I suspect they may know more about him than they're telling me. There are thousands of acres out there for him to hide in. If he's as experienced as I think, they may never find him. I check in every month or two and I'm always told that I'll be notified should anything change. And now that life has returned to normal, my cousins are planning to hunt the upcoming fall and spring seasons at the cabin. They went out to make repairs earlier this year and said they saw no sign of the guy in the area. For their sake, I hope the guy really is gone for good. And that's about all I can tell you. Until he's found, much of why he did what he did will remain a mystery. Our family vacation of 2018 would be the worst vacation of our entire lives. My first mistake was driving. In my mind, the whole ordeal would be easier if I did. I wasn't counting on my back acting up, and this made a 4-hour drive seem like an eternity. By the time we made it to Corpus Christi, I could barely walk. Most of my holiday was spent in bed watching TV. My wife did a great job handling the kids alone, but that doesn't mean everything was smooth sailing. Our second day there, she was wading in the ocean and stepped on a piece of glass. She would need 10 stitches in her big toe. No one in my family goes barefoot anywhere now. My 12-year-old son was the only one that got away unscathed. The wife and I have called him lucky ever since. Even after all this misfortune, none of us would be as unlucky as our daughter. Her terrible experience is the focus of this post. To make things simpler, I'll refer to her as Amelia. I don't think she'd appreciate me using her real name. The entire drive up, she'd been sullen and withdrawn. Had I been less focused on myself, I may have asked why. When she realized I wasn't going to be joining them on the beach, she wanted to stay in the room with me. My wife reluctantly agreed and left with our son. While I stared drowsily at the TV, I have a prescription for when my back decides to crap out, she frantically tapped away on her phone. For 3 days, all was well with the world. I dozed off at some point when I woke up, and Amelia was gone. I figured that she had gotten bored and joined her mother and brother on the beach. She was a responsible girl, or at least as responsible as a 16-year-old kid can be. I saw no reason to worry. I fell back asleep, and this time I was awakened by a pounding on the door, and it took me a few minutes to reach it. When I opened up, 2 police officers asked me my name and the name of my daughter. I went into full panic mode. I frantically started asking all kinds of questions. My mind was going in every direction possible. I was convinced something awful had happened to her. The officers were able to calm me down enough to explain that she was safe. About half an hour prior, she had been walking on the beach and discovered a body that apparently washed up. She reported it to a hotel employee and they called the police. They were there to notify us. I explained my situation and told them my wife was already down on the beach with our son. They left to find her, and I spent the better part of 30 minutes getting dressed. My wife and son were already on the scene when I arrived. Amelia was visibly shaken. I'm sure the experience was traumatic for her. Not long after, we were cleared to leave. We returned to the room and discussed what we should do, and it was quickly decided to end the vacation early. Because of my back, I would fly back with Amelia and my wife would return in the car with our son. We packed up and headed to the airport, and by dark we were back home, and this is when the process of healing finally began. Amelia had said very little on the flight back home. This was a different type of quiet. She didn't act pouty or entitled. A blank and boundless stare had taken its place. She was very clearly in a state of shock, but I knew this was not the time or place to discuss it. This behavior continued for several weeks. She had yet to say anything about what had occurred. My wife and I got her a counselor with whom she would gradually open up to. I'm happy to say that she's doing much better. Although these lockdowns and starting college made things more difficult, she was able to attend her sessions over Zoom, and thank God for technology. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. A few of you may be aware that I was engaged once before I met my current husband. In early 2000, I was working in IT for a company in Denver, and this is when I first met Mark. We flirted for several months before he got the nerve to ask me out. Our relationship quickly became serious. Later that year, I moved in with him. Only a few months after that, he proposed and I tearily accepted. The stress of planning the wedding left us both overwhelmed. When the time came for us to take our vacations, we chose a campout in the Rockies. Flying anywhere made us both nervous. I picked out a spot about an hour away and we set up camp. We arrived late on our first day and stuck close to camp. After a quick breakfast the next morning, we went out on a hike. The trail was a bit grown over, but still usable. Neither of us brought any water or snacks for the journey, and I had very little knowledge of bushcraft. I don't recall Mark ever talking about it. As a pair, we would be hopeless if we ever got lost. So, as it often is, that's exactly what happened. I had picked the place because I'd heard about this awesome pair of waterfalls. I didn't know exactly where they were, but I knew that they were close. We could hear them faintly in the distance. The trail split off at this point. This new trail was even rougher, but to our ears it was in the direction of the falls. We followed it for a long time, but the sound never got any louder. I suggested that we go off to the left. We'd surely run into the falls or a trail that led to it. Mark was reluctant but agreed without argument. After 15 minutes of fighting our way through the trees, we finally ran into another, more developed trail. We were sure that we were back on track now. However, a mile or more later, we were no closer. We were both tired and just wanted to get back to camp. We turned around and followed the trail back a few miles. The assumption was we'd eventually run into the original trail that led back to the camp. There was no sign of it, but we weren't yet concerned. Another hour passed and we still hadn't intersected with the trail. And this was the moment that we knew that we were lost. The sound of water had faded long ago. I thought that we had just missed our turn. If we went back the way we came, we had to hit it. It was 2:15 p.m. when we turned around. The next time I looked at my watch, it was 3:25 and we were still no closer. And this is when the fear began to hit me. By that point in the day, everything was a jumble. I was tired, hungry, and most of all, very thirsty. Mark had become uncharacteristically quiet, and this made things even worse. I became a panicked, ranting mess. Mark had enough and screamed, "Shut up," in my face. And it worked. I sat down, shut up, and listened. Mark calmly laid out a plan. We could hear the falls again, and we had to be close. And we would follow the sound through the trees until we reached the falls. We would not take any trails or shortcuts. Logic dictated that we would have to run into them eventually. Once we made it there, we would stay and wait until another tourist arrived and follow them out. If it was dark when we arrived, we would spend the night there and wait until someone arrived the next morning. And that's just what we did. We would finally reach the falls just before dark, and I was so happy to have water. I forgot that we were lost for a while, and little did I know, the hardest part was ahead of us. A fire was out of the question. Everything was back at camp. Neither Mark nor I knew any other way to start one. We were curled up together and tried to sleep, and the hours seemed to pass like years. The night got colder and colder. No matter how close we got together, it was never enough to keep you warm, and I began to violently shiver. At some point, I could feel myself drifting off, and relief soon gave way to fear. A little voice inside of me said that if I fell asleep, I may not wake up. I turned over and started shaking Mark to wake him up. It was very hard. He was angry and asked what I was doing, and I told him my fears, but he didn't want to listen. He started drifting off again, but I wouldn't let him, and this made him furious. He flew into an angry rant about shivering or something keeping you alive. It made no sense, but it gave me an idea. I decided to make things worse by bringing up something we had long dropped, and this made Mark livid, and the fight went on for hours from there. I kept the fight going as long as I could. Mark eventually caught on and laid back down. We laughed about it and talked about our plans for the future. My idea turned out to backfire on us. We were so exhausted from the argument we couldn't stay awake. I fought the urge to sleep for as long as I could, but at some point, I slipped away. The next thing I remember is someone shaking me and yelling. I didn't want to wake up, but they kept at it until I had to. My eyes opened to the sun shining and a middle-aged man talking to me. My head ached more than it ever has, and my vision was blurry. I sat up and looked behind me. Mark was awake and looked as if though he felt like I did. We couldn't explain much other than we got lost. And just like Mark had planned, the gentleman and his wife walked us out and back to our camp. The trip was over. We packed as fast as we could and drove back to Denver, and we spent the rest of the trip under a big comforter in a bed. We probably should have chosen that from the start, and now I carry a lighter with me now whenever I go, and even if it's just a trip to the store, I never want to be that cold again. Never. An ill feeling between Mark and I spawned from that trip. Although it was never said, Mark seemed to hold a grudge against me afterwards. I had been the one who chose the location and suggested the shortcut in the woods. I'd also brought up something he believed was buried between us. It may have eaten away at him after he had time to think more about it. He made backhanded comments about me in that trip more than once. A few times he did it in front of our friends. And over time it drove a wedge between us and what led to our split. In late 2002, we went our separate ways and haven't spoken since. I harbor no ill will towards him, and I don't think he does toward me. That was a long time ago. It's not important. I mainly wanted to share my story to illustrate the importance of getting basic survival instruction and preparing for every possible emergency. I hope the seriousness of this situation drives the point home to you. Whether it's about wilderness survival or changing a tire, I discovered preparedness is always your best option. Get trained, and you'll never regret it. Many summers of my childhood were spent exploring my grandparents' sprawling farm down in Texas. It was the location of many life-changing events. I broke my first bone there, and I even had my first kiss there. And this post is about one of those life-changing events. My first 5 years were spent at home with my mom. When I began school, Mom took a part-time job as a bookkeeper. Summer vacation came around, and the economy dictated that Mom keep working. And without Mom around to watch me, I was shipped off to my dad's parents' place. A few years on, my cousins joined me on the farm. Dad's parents were more than happy to take us in. Any farm can use an extra hand or two. The boys were put to work with Grandpa Ray, and my female cousin worked just as hard beside Grandma Ida preparing the day's meals and cleaning. This may sound like a lot to put upon a group of kids, but I assure you, we had plenty of time to mess around. My first vacation, Grandpa Ray taught me how to swim in the stock pond by throwing me in. I picked it up really quick. You'll probably be arrested if you did that now. It's not something I would have done with my kids, but Grandpa Ray was an old Marine. He had no time to coddle anyone, but it was never done out of malice. The event I want to talk about happened when I was 10. It was the infamous summer of 1980. That year still holds the record in several areas for highest temperature. I know the day I have in mind was well over 100 degrees. Had the creek and pond not been almost dried up, we would have been swimming. Incidentally, the next year, Grandpa Ray bought a big above-ground pool for us all. My cousin Wade and I spent most of the morning shading ourselves under the trampoline. The area hadn't seen rain in quite some time. A web of deep and dry cracks riddled the black dirt, and he and I were curious how deep the cracks went. So, we began to dig. We got maybe 6 inches down when Wade's little sister, Beth, came outside. She wanted to swing on the tire swing, but the limb which held the rope had broken. Since I was the oldest, I was nominated to climb the tree and retie the rope. I took the rope in my teeth, and Wade boosted me up to the first limb. It appeared strong enough, but it bent considerably when I put any weight on it. Another slightly larger limb was just above it. I pulled myself up onto it and shimmied about 3 or 4 feet. I felt confident enough to sit upright and tied some weird knot around the limb. I told Beth to pull down on the tire to test it, and it held. Satisfied, I turned around and began to crawl back to the trunk. I made it back about a foot when I heard a loud crack. I yelled out, "Oh God," and the limb gave way. I didn't see my life pass before me, but things did seem to go in slow motion. The crack and the separation of the limb from the trunk, Beth's blood-curdling scream, it all seemed to last so long. Just before I hit the ground, I thought this may mean that I wouldn't get hurt, and this was a stupid idea. I landed back down with my left arm between myself and the ground. The wind was knocked out of me and I blacked out. I wasn't out but maybe for a few seconds. When I opened my eyes, Grandpa Ray was already carrying me to their station wagon. He carefully laid me down in the back seat and raced to the hospital in town. I remember very little from the ride. I may have blacked out again, and the next thing I recall was being in the ER. The doctors and nurses coming and going. Grandpa Ray assured me that I was going to be okay. Grandma Ida arrived with my cousins an hour or so later, and I found out that I'd broken my arm and had a concussion. In my teens, I began to have problems with my back. They probably stemmed from that fall, too. The doctor said, had I fallen from a higher place, I probably would have fared much worse. Despite being doped out of my mind, the process of making the cast enchanted me, and I was held overnight for observation and released the next morning. I would spend the rest of the vacation digging more holes, among other things. I still had my cast the first week of school. All my friends signed it for me, and I wanted to keep it afterwards, but My mom got the nurse to throw it away because it stunk. I would spend another 4 summers on the farm before I was old enough to stay on my own. Grandma and Grandpa became a smaller and smaller part of my lives. They had both passed away before I realized how important they were to me. I'm happy to say that the farm is still in the family, although it's much smaller than it once was. Currently, Wade and his family are living there. I visit them anytime I happen to be in their neck of the woods. The craggy old oak tree remains. A tire swing still hangs from one of its massive limbs, and it's good to see no matter how things change, some things still manage to survive. Just yesterday, my mother and I received some news we'd hoped we'd never get. According to Brazilian and U.S. officials, a set of remains were discovered in a shallow grave near some small unnamed village. Several tests were done, including dental comparisons, and it has been determined that they belong to my oldest brother, Raphael. We had lost contact with him in late 2017. The story of what happened during that period still has a lot of holes that need to be filled, but this is what little we think we know. Growing up, Raphael had been very close to my father. When our father passed away from cancer when Raphael was 15, he lost his way. Much of his next 10 years were spent searching. At 25, he was more aimless than ever. A friend suggested he join the army, and this turned out to be a blessing. Surrounded by all sorts of strong male leaders, he learned to become his own man. After 2 combat deployments, he left the military in a far better state. He wasn't quite ready to give up helping others yet, though. He found a non-profit providing aid to indigenous groups throughout Central and South America. Raphael joined them and remained with them for 3 years. During this time, he made a lot of friends. Many he stayed in contact with when he returned to America. After he left the non-profit, he traveled the country and explored. He slept on friends' couches and worked odd jobs, and this is the point in which we lost contact with him. It wasn't out of the ordinary to go long periods not speaking to him. We were confident in his ability to take care of himself. And here's where I'm forced to go by second-hand information and assumptions. After not hearing from him for almost 6 months, Mom and I became concerned. We contacted every friend we knew of and got no real answers, at least not at first. A week went by and we received a call back from one of Raphael's co-workers with the aid group. Through another person, he was contacted and told Raphael that he had taken a vacation trip back to Brazil to see some friends. A man he met online joined him. The friends in Brazil verified that Raphael had visited them once and promised to return one more time before leaving the country. He had been accompanied by the unknown man, who himself was Brazilian. The friend said that he was very quiet and almost unfriendly toward them, and this is the last time anyone can verify him being alive. Nobody we've spoken to knows the identity of the man he'd taken with him on the trip. It was suggested that he was along to serve as a guide and interpreter, but most of his coworkers asserted that Raphael spoke Portuguese and a couple native languages relatively well. Not to mention, he knew his way around much of the country. Those places he wasn't aware of, he wouldn't have any problem finding willing locals to assist him. He was well known and liked, especially among many in the native community. And that's about the extent of what we can share with you. We are grateful to the authorities here and in Brazil for all the effort they put forward to bring our Raphael home to us. That said, I can't pretend to be happy with the result. To date, very little is known as to how he lost his life. The cause of death was ruled as undetermined. My hope is that the unknown Brazilian man will soon be identified, and he can fill in all the empty spots that currently exist. I'm afraid to say, until then, we are left with far more questions than answers. I want to thank all of those who helped us in our search and provided the information needed that led to the discovery of Raphael's body. Should any important updates arise, we will be sure to share them with you all here. I also want to thank everyone for their support in this terribly trying time. You have been a light when all around us seems so dark. I've discussed this with my wife. and we thought it may be good for me to finally tell my story. It would, at the very least, allow our children to know why their grandfather passed. I hope you understand why this process has been so difficult for me once you read it. That's my personal reason for doing this. I'm not the counseling type of guy. This will have to be my therapy. Now, with all that said, what follows is my memory of what happened that day. My dad was a quiet, serious, and no-nonsense man. If he didn't want to do something, nobody could make him do it, even if it kept you safe. Seatbelts were his number one pet peeve. He hated them and refused to wear them even though they were required. He'd been ticketed several times, but he continued to refuse. Mom even showed him statistics proving they kept you safe, but it fell on deaf ears. He was uncompromising and set in his ways, and this trait would end up being what killed him. The accident would occur on July 23, 1995. At the time, I was 12 years old. The family had taken a short camping trip to a lake on the Texas-Oklahoma border. It was the first and only vacation that we were going to have that year. The entire weekend had been one endless mess. It was miserably hot, and my sister got a severe sunburn. I think we all got devoured by bugs also. I know I couldn't stop scratching for weeks after. That morning we were driving back through Oklahoma. Everyone seemed to be driving ridiculously slow and dangerously. This was driving my dad crazy. He desperately wanted to get back home before dark. To add to the stress of the situation, I was picking on my sister and slapping her sunburnt shoulders. This made her scream like a banshee. Mom was doing her best to keep us in check. It made Dad even crazier than he already was. At some point, about halfway across the state, we got behind a truck. It was going fast enough, but the bed was stacked high with all types of junk. Dad paid it no concern. He was just happy to finally be going the speed limit, although knowing him, we were probably going way over it. The environment in the car had relaxed. I was listening to Metallica on my headphones, and everyone else was just sitting quietly. Dad had the radio turned down. Suddenly, something flew out of the bed of the truck. I looked up, and Dad was swerving out of control. He regained it just in time for the second collision. We slammed into the back of the truck, doing 50 at least. Rather than pull over, the truck stopped right in the middle of the highway. The next thing I remember was waking up in a lot of pain. The seatbelt had stopped me, but it did nothing to slow all the objects flying from the back of the car. My sister had also been struck and was very confused. Our mom was fussing over us and making sure we were okay. Everyone was relatively unhurt. Everyone but Dad. Mom looked over. She had an expression of horror on her face. She was sobbing and rubbing my dad's arms. And that was when I knew that he was gone. I had to look even if I didn't want to. I slowly unlocked my belt and leaned forward. His upper body was leaning onto the collapsed steering wheel. His head was turned facing my mom, and blood covered the windshield where his head had made contact. You could tell that he never saw it coming. It's the only comfort I carry with me until this day. Of course, the stubborn jerk just wasn't wearing a seatbelt. From then on, it's all a blur, really. Emergency services arrived and took us all to the hospital. The driver of the truck was fine, but for a sore neck. Family from Kansas City arrived later that evening, and we returned home with them the following day. As it always must, life for us carried on. Mom kept the family afloat until my sister and I went off to college, and she would eventually remarry a really good guy named Larry. Since I've become a father, it has been my primary goal to set a good example for my children. I love my dad, but he was a selfish man. If you have kids, be mindful of your own safety as well as your children's. It's your duty to be there to guide them into adulthood. If you're dead, you can't do that. But that's just my 2 cents. Thank you to all who took the time to read this, and I hope it helped you all as much as it helped me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, sometimes we say nice things.
I lived in a sketchy part of the neighborhood, but I'd never had a job outside than helping my mum, so I was pretty naive and gullible at the time. I was out of high school and looking for a job. I'd worked with my mum junior to senior year cleaning houses, but I wanted to work somewhere else and gain some outside experience. When I graduated high school, my mum and I decided that it was time to look for another job because I needed some money for college. My mum loved to read newspapers, and we would get a Spanish newspaper every single week. I would look through it once in a while to read the comics or see job ads at the end. And one evening, I was so determined to find an ad that paid well and was something else that would give me another set of work skills. I was going through the classification section at the end of the newspaper when I found what I thought to be the perfect job for me. I don't remember word for word, but it was something along the lines of looking for young females, ages 18 to 25, for an open message position at this location. Now, the location they gave was like 0.3 miles away from where I stayed or something, so again, I thought it was perfect. I could walk to and from without having to worry about transportation since we only had one car. Massage training was going to be provided as well, and the pay was really good. And it said that our girls earn anywhere from $500 to $900 a week, and I thought, whoa, what a great wage. I can pay off my college in no time. I was so excited that I fit the profile that I showed my mum the job ad. My mum wasn't excited like I was, and she told me that it looked a little suspicious, that I should call first to see if there really was another person on the other side. So I did call, and a lady answered. I asked about the free training, how much do you really make, and where the location was exactly. She seemed really sweet on the phone and told me before we moved forward that they were doing interviews and already had other candidates on their list. She said that I could come in for an interview to see if I would make it to the second round of interviews, and I agreed. She gave me the address, and I looked it up, and when I saw that it was only 0.3 miles away from my apartment, I was really happy. So I told my mum that I was going to go to the interview at a set time, at this location, and alone. She told me that there was no way that I was going to go alone, and she would come with me. I was really mad because I wanted to do this myself without her having to help me, because in my little mind I thought that I was all grown up and didn't need her help. But the day came and she drove us in the only car that we had. The address that the lady gave me was weird though, because it took us to a motel behind the shopping plaza that was next to our apartment. And it just didn't make any sense to me why they would have an interview there. So we just kind of circled the plaza looking for the place, and my mum got frustrated and told me to just call the lady for the exact location. So I did, and she told me that they were in the motel room, such and such number, and that they were there because it was a safety precaution. It seemed to make sense to me, so I told her that I could still not find the place, so if she could speak to my mother and tell her exactly where the place was. And then she said, "You're with your mother?" This time, her voice changed from sweet to almost angry and a panicked one. I said yes, and I'm with her right now because she's driving me, so I passed the phone to my mum and she said hello 3 times or so. But the lady had just hung up on her. So I called 2 more times, but she just never picked up the phone. I was mad at the lady that she just hung up like that, and so we just went back home. And I never did put 2 and 2 together until about 3 years after, when I heard on the news that there was a newspaper job ad that had been busted and the people were charged with human trafficking. The ad was very similar to the one that I had read years ago, and I thanked my mum over and over because if it wasn't for her that day, I could have been dead or had been trafficked multiple times by now. I really don't know where I would have ended up. I am so grateful for my mum, despite me being so angry at her for coming with me that day, because if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be where I am today. That's for sure. So my husband and I met in college. I won't name names for the sake of privacy, but we went to one of those region's oldest colleges, over 200 years old, and it was known to be very haunted. We started dating our freshman year, and we pretty much started living together right away. I was a commuter, so I would stay over in his dorm often. And in our junior year, my husband, boyfriend at the time, Jay, landed a sweet living situation where he was able to have a bedroom to himself in a larger suite with only 2 guy suite mates. This was the ideal situation for us because it meant that I could basically live with him during the school year since he didn't have a person sharing a bedroom with him. This living situation was obviously incredibly beneficial for me, and I loved it. Aside from having to share a twin XL bed with a 6'2", 250-pound linebacker, it was pretty awesome. But it didn't take me long at all to realize just how haunted the building was. I have a ton of stories about my experiences in the building and on the campus in general, but explaining them all in one video would be way too long. I'll discuss a few of the big ones though, so that there's a bit of context. So, Jay was an RA and had to do a lot of work to prepare the suites for all the other students who would be moving in soon. And because of this, he was actually able to move in about a week before anybody else. On the day that we were moving Jay's things into the building, I had multiple sightings of a tall black shadowy figure. I would always catch it in the corner of my eye, and it would just quickly duck out of sight every time that I did a double take or tried to look at it more closely. I saw this figure probably 4 or 5 times in the move in the day and didn't think much of it until I remembered that the building was basically empty, except for Jay and me. Other experiences too included hearing voices, hearing scratching, banging, thumping at times when it couldn't be explained, a very creepy night alone on campus during a holiday break when a major storm hit and all the power went out, and more. We had a lot of creepy experiences, but my least favorite part of living in this building was honestly just the feeling that I got being there alone. If I was ever alone in any part of the room, I just immediately would feel a presence enter the space that I was in. It felt intense and loud and really scary. The best way that I can explain it is that it felt like someone was standing beside me and screaming in my face, but there was no sound. We lived with this weird presence the entire time that we were in this building, and we honestly were fine for months. But then something weird started happening. Jay would start waking up in the middle of the night by speaking a different language. I know that saying speaking in tongues sounds ridiculous, but I honestly don't know how else to describe it. I swear that he sounded like he was speaking a completely foreign language, but it was a language that I couldn't identify and had never heard before. He always sounded really intense and had an almost aggressive tone to his garbled words too, or whatever he was saying. But anyway, he woke me up by talking in his sleep like this every night for a few months, in fact. It really creeped me out, but I never really said anything about it until one night. It scared me so terribly that I honestly had no other choice. So I woke up one night to find Jay was on top of me. Remember that we shared a twin XL bed, and he's a huge guy. I was on my back, and he was straddling me with his palms flat on the bed and either side of my head. His eyes were wide open, and he was bent down and kind of staring at my face. I immediately was spooked, but just sort of played it off by saying something like, "Hi babe, you good? Is everything okay?" There was no response, and Jay just continued to stare through me and didn't even move, didn't even blink. I kept this up for a minute or two, thinking that he was potentially just being silly or was groggy from sleep and couldn't form his words. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but it was really like 3 or 4 minutes maybe. He then got off me, climbed over to me to get out of bed, and stood still in the room for a few seconds. After that, he turned sharply to look at the desk and the chair in the bedroom. He pulled the chair out from the desk, turned it around 180 degrees so that it was facing him, walked around the chair 3 times in a circle, and then stood back to face the chair directly. He stood staring at the seat of the chair for about a minute, and then got back into bed with me, and then just immediately fell asleep. The entire time that this was happening, I was just kind of watching with my mouth wide open. I know that I tried to call to him, get his attention a few times to see what he was doing, but at a certain point, all I could do was just sort of watch in bewilderment. This was definitely the strangest thing that had ever happened to me. I told Jay all about what he did the next morning, and he was really upset because it scared me so badly. He is also not and has never been a sleepwalker or a sleep talker. Shortly after this event, though, I decided to cleanse the place with some help from a friend. We did, and things really quietened down after that. Jay continued to talk in his sleep every now and again for the rest of that school year, and even here and there for the next school year. We've been married and living in our own place since we graduated, almost 2 years now, and I haven't heard Jay sleep talk or seen him sleepwalk a single time since we left living on campus. I know deep down that that building was haunted, and I really believe that whatever it was attached to Jay for some reason and tried to speak through him or something. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'm sorry that this is a bit long. I tried to condense it as much as possible to make it an easy listen, but if anyone has any ideas as to what was going on in that building, I would love to hear from them. I want to start by saying that I'm a stay-at-home mum. A very stay-at-home loner mum with a family so far away that it doesn't feel right to have them worry. Tonight I tucked my oldest kid into bed, and on my way out to my new nightly ritual of feeding my neighbour's cat, my husband made a joke about wanting corn dogs from 7-Eleven. I don't get out much and don't mind, so I said that we needed milk anyways, and I just went on my way. The neighbours was uneventful, except that one hellcat hooked her nail into my middle finger when I was giving her treats. Because of this too, I left earlier than usual and I headed straight to the store. It's just after 9 p.m. and I pull up to the 7-Eleven, parking alongside the building, unobstructed windows spanning the entire length of the building. It's well lit. I immediately notice a gentleman in blue standing up on the sidewalk. I pay no mind but start gathering my things. My finger still really hurts, so I'm taking my time and cursing that gorgeous cat, when I hear a man's voice mumble something. My window is partially open, but my windshield is already fogging up, and when I look up, I see that he's walking towards my passenger side. He starts trying to open my door, but thank God that my kids broke that door handle and it won't open. I immediately step out of my car, and with me standing in my open door, looking out across the windshield, I say, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" And he starts saying over and over, "Are you the yellow cab? Are you the yellow cab?" I say again, "I don't know you. I'm not letting you in my car." He realizes that he can't get in and people are watching, so he starts walking away from my car and I run inside. I am a little shaken, I'll admit, but I try to sum it up to mistaken identity. But we live in a small town and our cabs are just random cars. So I'm walking around and trying to make sure that he isn't near my car, and at one point I see him looking like he was walking away. I call my husband and tell him a little bit about what happened, just to hear him say that it's probably nothing. But, corn dogs in hand, I walk out and head towards my car. Visions of this guy in my back seat flashing through my head. I see him walking away from my car, but now he has a backpack. Something flashes on the side of the pack, and it hits me that I didn't lock my doors when I ran inside. And this piece of shit mother lover has my 5-year-old son's backpack. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I walked maybe 2 feet from my car and yelled, "That's my son's backpack." I thought that he might bolt, but he actually started walking back towards me instead. I said again, "That's my son's backpack," and he again starts saying, "Are you the yellow cab?" I yell louder, "That's my son's backpack, give it back to me." For a millisecond I even consider the fact that this might not be my son's backpack, and I panic, but I'm convinced in the moment that I see the bus pass. This man is still going on about the yellow cab, and I looked at him, furious mama bear as pissed. I take an extra long look at what he was wearing, and there were hospital blue pajama pants and a deep but vibrant blue hoodie with a WOT logo, and the O has some sort of hemisphere lines of something on it. All of this happens in a few seconds, and I just remember looking at him, pissed, and telling him that he's effed for stealing a little kid's backpack and to get the hell out of here. Maybe it's because I live in Canada, or maybe it was because I didn't leave the area where I could be seen, but he started walking away. I went inside immediately and told the clerks, but I didn't think any of us knew what to do. For a second I was going to call the cops, but it was just a backpack after all. But I just couldn't help but think about him trying to get into the car with me in it. So, in the end, I called the police. I started telling them what was happening, and then I saw the guy again. I followed him while on the phone, and I parked way ahead of him. Time passes quickly when you're on the phone with the cops, and the guy passes my car. He turns back and sees that it's me and turns around. I haven't turned off my car, so I panic, but I shift into drive and start driving away. This man wasn't scared. He was actually walking back to my car, and as I'm driving away, I tell the officer, "What the hell is he thinking? This is so dangerous. I gave you his description and his general location. I've got to go home." We finished the conversation on the way, and I gave them my info and the guys as well. I really can't tell you why I followed him as well. I mean, I follow a lot of true crime, and I guess that I just couldn't not report a man trying to get into my car, right? I told the police the same as well, and we got off the phone and I went inside. Now, my husband is good at pointing out people's hardships, and it's clear that this man had mental health issues, and I suspect some sort of addiction issue as well. He was rather thin with large scabs on his face. He kind of dumbed down how I felt about it, and I think that's why I wanted to share this. What happened, it actually scared me, and I don't know why I did what I did, but maybe it was silly, I don't know. All of it seemed stupid, I suppose, but I approached the guy, I drove after him, and I know that I'm ridiculously slow sometimes, but I did get the backpack back, but it was stupid, I know. Anyway, I received a phone call 5 minutes before I started writing this, and the police, they actually got him. He is going to the station for the night because he's extremely intoxicated. The officer's words were, we pulled up with our lights on and he asked if we were a yellow cab. A part of me feels like maybe he was just drunk or something. But a part of me also thinks that this guy was using that as an excuse as to why he would be thinking to get into my car like that. I definitely had an adrenaline rush, and now I'm just really tired, but if you've gotten this far, then thanks for listening, and man, what a weird night. This all happened in 2007. I was 9 years old, and my friend, Hannah, was 8. Now, every summer, her parents would take us to a campsite about maybe 3 hours from home in northern Ontario, Canada. This campsite was in the Bourwash district. You can Google search the prison for more information. But anyways, camp consisted of a few cottages or trailers set up in a large park on the shore of a large lake. Each summer we'd be greeted by our friends that we'd made the previous years and we'd have ample fun. This year, though, was different, because we met a girl named Emily. She was our age but shy. She'd never eat or stay over too late. We always assumed her parents were just strict. We had sleepovers, took photos together, and she kind of became the third in our Three Musketeers group setting. One day, we were actually swimming. There was a floating dock with a slide in it, and we decided to each take our turn to go down to make the biggest splashes. My turn came, and for some reason I was carried under the dock, and as I was trying to maneuver out from under it, Emily began holding me under the entire time. She wouldn't let go of me, and finally Hannah grabbed me and pulled me up. We both got out of the water and ran to the camp, and we were pretty freaked out that our friend would try what I saw as drowning me. The next day was the last day that we were at the camp. Emily came by and acted like nothing happened. She spent the day trying to convince us to walk along a river to a huge building. She said it was just a few hours away, but we could spend our last day there and we'd have so much fun. We both felt like something was off, though, and decided that we better not go. Nothing else happened after that, and we kind of just went home, and the following year, Emily wasn't there. A few years ago, though, we were looking at our camp pictures while celebrating my 18th birthday. When we reached the 2007 photos, we noticed Emily was missing from them. Curiously, we asked Hannah's mum, who told us she always assumed that Emily was our imaginary friend, that she had never actually seen Emily. In the photos that we have, you can clearly tell that we left spacing for Emily in between myself and Hannah in most of our photos. We decided to, without speaking to one another, write down the characteristics about Emily that would define her, and, amazingly, we wrote down the exact same thing. Green eyes, brown hair to the shoulder, very fair in skin tone and very skinny. What freaks me out the most, though, is that I remember being trapped under that dock, and I remember her holding me there. But if she wasn't real, then what was holding me under the dock? There was no way that we both imagined the same girl, same name, same experiences and descriptions of her. We also remember her trying to get us to follow a river, and we realized that the river actually went to the prison. And when we started reading up on the prison too, we realized that apparently there were tons of encounters that people have had there. Now, to be clear, I'm not a believer in the paranormal per se, but this honestly just has me stumped. I have no idea why we both saw Emily and why she tried to drown me or why she wanted to lure us out to a prison, but needless to say, we did visit said prison in the middle of the night, and that in its own is a completely different story that I may someday write about, but I still cannot explain who Emily was, and how we both saw her, the same little girl, and why she wanted me drowned, and why she wanted us at the prison. I'm wondering, though, have any of you guys had a similar experience? This was maybe 5 years ago now, and to this day, it gives me the creeps. So I was with my buddy on our way to a friend's house to catch a UFC fight. We had stopped at the store for a case of beer, and on the way to my friend's house, we missed the turn. Luckily, in that neighborhood, all of the streets are sort of connected, so instead of doing a U-turn, I just told my buddy, just catch the next turn and do a full circle so we can turn around like that. The streets are pretty narrow, so it's a residential area, and we're in a pickup truck with 24-inch rims. And well, he starts slowing down, and I'm looking at a scratch-off to see if I won, when my buddy goes, "Hey look, someone's husky is just sitting in the middle of the road." I look up, and I'm like, "Nah man, that's way too big to be a husky." So I told him to switch to his high beams, and as soon as he did, whatever it was, did not like it. So like I said, my friend's truck is sitting on big wheels, and this thing still looked huge. It was maybe less than 10 feet away from us. When the light hit it, it turned its head, and when I say that we saw a human face on this thing, I mean that we could make out eyes, nose, mouth, everything. Then, it literally just spread these big-ass wings and took flight. No noise from the wings and nothing. We literally had to pull over to the side of the road to just kind of evaluate what the hell we just saw. We got to my friend's house and told them what we had just saw, but they didn't take us seriously. And we still don't know what the hell we saw that night. I was 12 years old at the time that this happened. It was the summer of 1984, and I was out of school for the season, and this particular day, my mum had to go out. She told me that she would be back in about half an hour, and then she left. And after a few minutes, I realized that I needed to use the bathroom. I went to use the normal upstairs bathroom, but I realized at that moment that I had left my Archie comic in the downstairs bathroom. I deeply disliked the basement, and I seriously disliked the downstairs bathroom, but sometimes it was necessary to use it if someone else was in the other one. I decided that I would just run down to grab my comic and head back up the stairs to do my business. So I headed downstairs on the run, but by the time that I reached the bathroom, I realized that the need to go was so urgent that I had no time to make it back up the stairs. So I sat down in the bathroom after locking the door and made the best of it. Now, this bathroom was small, and when I mean small, I mean really tiny. When I sat on the toilet, for instance, the corner of the sink sat just above my left knee. And if I stretched my arm out in front of me, I could touch the other side of the room where the shower stall curtain was. Directly to the right of me was the door, and I could easily touch the doorknob and the lock above the handle as well. The lock consisted of nothing more than a hook and eye deal, and wouldn't stand up to anyone pulling on it hard, as it would simply come out of the wall. But it was enough that if someone tried the door, that it would give them reasonable resistance, and then they would realize that the bathroom was already in use. Simple enough, and generally sufficient for what it was needed for, I suppose. But anyway, so when I went into the bathroom, even though nobody was home at the time, I shut the door and slipped the metal hook into the eye and thought nothing of it at the time. I quickly got lost in the world of Archie Andrews and the gang of characters that went to Riverdale High until I heard a noise above me. I knew nobody was home, but perhaps someone had come home while I was downstairs. I stopped reading and was listening intently when I heard the first heavy footsteps on the basement stairs. It was unusually loud as well, and sounded like whoever it belonged to was really large and very, very heavy. I knew how many stairs there were, so as the heavy thudding on the stairs came slowly and deliberately closer, I counted. 1, 2, 8, 9, 14, 16. I thought that I was scared by the time that it reached the third stair, but by the time that it had reached the 10th, I could actually hear it, and it just took my breath away. As it descended, the sound of rushing air and sort of laughter came floating down the stairs and the hallway through the bathroom door, and it gave me the shivers. I could hear it round the corner as it came to the bottom of the stairs and down the hallway towards me. I dropped the Archie book on the floor in a panic and grabbed for the door handle as I realized that it was now just outside the bathroom door. I could hear this rushing of wind still and this laughter, all at one time sort of jumbled together like many voices and calling out sort of names or something. I held onto the doorknob with all my might as it began to twist and turn in my hands as whatever was outside the door tried to get inside the bathroom with me. The door shook with the violent tugging from the other side, threatening to tear the door from the very hinges. I thought ironically for a moment that it was a good thing that I was sitting on the toilet right then, because otherwise, what was going so freely into the toilet would have definitely been flowing down my legs. Time seemed to sort of stretch on as the struggle continued, and I battled with whatever was on the other side of the door for possession of the doorknob, but I don't really know for just how long it went. It could have been only seconds, or perhaps even minutes, but for however long it was, the tears were rushing down my cheeks, and I screamed in terror the entire time. And then, just in a sort of single moment, it stopped. And I was by myself in the bathroom, still shrieking in terror at nothing. The noise was gone, the tugging and the pulling on the door was over, and there was just nothing. I sat there, shaking violently for what seemed like an eternity, not daring to let go of the doorknob lest that beast I had wrestled with was still on the other side of the door, silently waiting to hear them let go and breathe a sigh of relief, only to pounce and tear the door from its hinges. In fact, I didn't even relax a single muscle until I heard my mum's footsteps above me and heard her call for me. I screamed to her that I was downstairs and to come down and help me. Mum came rushing down after a few moments and asked if I was in the bathroom. I said yes, that I would be out in just a minute, and I quickly cleaned up and hesitantly opened the door, hoping that it was really my sweet mum and not a horrible trick of some kind. But it really was my mum, and I threw myself into her arms, sobbing and trying to tell her what just happened. She looked at me skeptically and then said, "What's your blood sugar?" I said, "What?" And again she said, "What's your blood sugar? When was the last time you checked it?" I had been diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic just 2 years before this, and although I did take great care of myself on my own, I still needed my parents' help from time to time. And she obviously thought that this was one of those times. I realized that once again she didn't believe me, instead thinking that it must be my overactive imagination and that it may have also been related to low blood sugar or something of that sort. So I went upstairs and took my blood sugar for her, and I don't really remember what it was, but it definitely was okay. But I was left with remaining sadness that my mother didn't believe me, and it wasn't the first time odd things had happened, and it definitely wasn't the last either. But years later, the way things turned out, she would eventually believe me just fine. I know that this story is going to sound a bit like bullshit, but I can assure you that it actually happened to my cousin and I in the summer of 2018. My cousin and I lived pretty close to each other in the suburbs of Detroit. We both love photography and taking long drives listening to music, so that's exactly what we did on this particular day. We drove for about an hour to a small town and found an abandoned barn that was also for sale. At the time, we actually didn't spot any trespassing signs, so we decided to be adventurous and go and check it out. But boy, was that a big mistake. So the barn was in semi-decent condition, although the paint had begun to peel off. Structurally it was pretty sound though, so I didn't feel uneasy about going inside of it. I'm an avid urban explorer in Detroit and had been in far worse buildings up to this stage. Once we got inside, we somehow ended up in the basement of this barn though. And man, was I immediately getting some weird-ass vibes in there. There were little girls' clothes and toys and furniture just littered throughout the basement of this barn, and I thought it was creepy as hell, and so did my cousin. Before I continue though, behind the barn was a pretty decent-sized cornfield. This cornfield backed up right into the barn, so we decided to be artsy and take a few pics in the corn stalks. I snapped a few shots of my cousin, and we decided it's time to head back to the car. Walking through the first row of corn on my way back to my cousin's car, I see a vertebrae in the dirt. And at this point, I stopped dead in my tracks in disbelief. Like, is this actually what I think it is, or is this an animal bone of some kind? I start looking around, and oh shit, there were several more. They were too big to be a deer, and I yell for my cousin, who was almost back to the car now, and have her take a look. We both start really examining the ground, and we find more and more bones. Now, for the record too, I had actually taken cadaver lab and human anatomy in college, so I'm very familiar with the human body. We found a fibula and a fully intact femur, and that's when I really started to freak the hell out. We decided to call the cops because we knew that this was serious at this stage. We waited in the car for a good 15 minutes, totally freaking out, until the cops arrived. Once the cops came, there was two of them, we all started looking through the corn and nearby trash pile. The cops, I don't think, believed us at first, and I distinctly remember them saying that they thought it was a deer carcass. That was, until I found a full-blown rib cage in the trash pile, and then they changed their tune real quick. The cops told us that they would need us to leave and that they were calling for a full forensics team out to start collecting evidence and whatnot. We were totally shaken up, and on the way out, I finally saw that no trespassing sign, and I'm sure the cops did too, but they just didn't care at that stage. We gave the cops our information, but we never did hear anything from them. I also watched the news pretty closely for the next few weeks, and I didn't see anything. But this was definitely one of the most creepy things that I've ever experienced. So, I was listening to a story on here that reminded me of my experience. I'm 21 now, but I was around 13 when this happened. So, first off, I want to say that I know that this sounds really fake, but the whole thing to me was just odd. My friend and I, both girls, were sleeping out in a tent in her paddock and just talking about school and sports, etc. It was pretty late, but we were so ecstatic to even be allowed out in the tent that we weren't sleeping. I decided that I wanted to scare her, so I pretended that I could hear breathing outside. I acted super scared and said something along the lines of, "Oh my goodness, can you hear that? Someone's outside the tent." She became super quiet, like she was trying to listen, and her face kind of dropped. Keep in mind, I was completely joking, until I actually heard breathing. I thought that I was making it up in my head, as it was just too weird of a coincidence to joke about it, and then for it to actually happen. I look over at her and she mouths, "I can hear it," and we're both frozen and sit there staring at each other, not knowing what to do. The breathing, it was pretty heavy, which made it 10 times scarier, literally starts circling the tent, and we hear footsteps that sound as though they're trying to be quiet. We sat there for about 2 minutes in complete fear. The breathing kind of stops and the footsteps abruptly sprint off behind the back end of the tent. We then see a faint blue and red light coming up her driveway. Her dad was a cop, so we thought that it was him, although I don't know why he would have his lights going, but we were 13, so we weren't the brightest. Anyway, we both took this as an opportunity to sprint across the paddock to the driveway, which was around 600 meters away, and we get to the cop, who wasn't her dad. Her dad then comes out of the house confused, as there's a cop and 2 girls who were supposed to be asleep with panicked faces. We then learned that there was an unstable guy who stole a car around their area and fled up through people's backyards trying to hide. The part that I found most messed up, though, was the fact that I tried to scare her with some bullshit lie, and then it actually happened. So my family and I moved into a new house, which is a 2x4 house. It used to have an attic, but it's been sealed off. After a couple of months into living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and I hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as a bird, as they're common where we live. After 3 weeks, the scratching has gotten worse though and more frequent. It was kind of like it was trying to scratch its way out of the roof. By the way, too, the attic entrancey thing is above the outside of my sister's room. One day, my sister tells my dad that the seal is open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off. My dad goes to close it and realizes that it's actually really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it must have been pretty strong. And that was the point when I started to get skeptical. The same night I go to get some snacks from the fridge and I open it to find out that they're gone. I thought that my siblings must have eaten it, and in the morning my parents are going on about a missing cake, because that cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They asked if I had anything to do with it, and I said no, along with my siblings. I was getting really suspicious about the attic though, so I built up the courage to go and check it out. Note too that I'm probably the most paranoid person in the world, so I was scared for my life, but my curiosity got the better of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife just in case. I open the opening thingy, whatever it's called. I shine my torch in there to see nothing. But as I search more, I see the cake, empty snack packets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes in its spot. Immediately I bolt and scream for my parents and I tell them everything. They tell me to stay in my room and they go up and check it out, but when they do, whoever was there was gone. I'm still pretty shook up from that moment and I still get nightmares from it from time to time. We have since moved on from that house and now live a normal, non-scary life, but it's certainly something that I'll never forget. This happened yesterday, and I still can't believe that it happened. I'm still pretty freaked out, and I'll explain it all at the end, so I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing as I'm telling it. So I've recently moved into a new flat 3 weeks ago, and I'm sharing it with my sister. The only person we know properly is a single mum who lives in the apartment next door to us. Ever since we moved in, she's been giving us advice and helping us out with things. But we don't know anyone else properly yet. From what we've seen of our neighbours, though, they're mostly couples in their 30s or 40s or older guys who live alone. We're probably the youngest ones here. We're both females. I'm 18 and my sister is only 16. So today I was out with friends and then later on I went to the gym. After this I went to get my sister so that we could go out for some food, and we got in around 10 p.m. I think. Me and my sister, though, we got into our pajamas and were just sitting around watching TV when our buzzer rang. I jumped up to answer it, and it turned out to be our neighbour, the single mum. I asked her what was up, and she said that our dad was asking for us downstairs. Straight away, my stomach dropped, and I immediately asked her if she was sure that he said that he was our dad. The reason I asked her was to just make sure that that's actually what she said. But she replied that, yeah, he said that he was our dad and was asking for us. The neighbour asked me if she could let him into our flat, but I told her not to do that. I wanted to tell my sister, but I also didn't want to worry her right away. So I asked the neighbour not to let anyone come up yet, and I heard her repeat this to him. I couldn't hear anything for a few minutes after this, and I started to get really worried. At this point, my sister comes up to me and asks who it is. I start to feel really anxious and call out to my neighbour a few times. It must have only been about 5 minutes, but it felt like ages when she didn't reply. I was actually about to tell my sister to call the police when, eventually, she told me that he was gone. She then came up to our flat and explained what went down. She said that she was walking to her flat after finishing work and she saw a man by the buzzers. At first, she assumed that he was just somebody who lived there, until he noticed her walking up and he asked for us by name and if she could let him up to our flat. She asked him who he was and he told her that he was our dad. Now, obviously, she then buzzed us and told us first, as our neighbour doesn't know us that well, so she doesn't know what our dad looks like. She said that because you were young, she didn't want to buzz in a strange man up to our flat. She said that her mother instincts kicked in when she heard my hesitation to let him up to the flat as well. Apparently after he heard me say that as well, he got really pushy with her and started trying to move her out of the way. He kept saying to her, "It's okay, I'm their dad, let me in, I'm not going to do anything." She started arguing with him and asked him to tell her his name, but he refused to tell her. She told him that if I don't feel comfortable letting him in, then there's no way that he was getting in. His reaction was to call her a bitch and then get in a car and ride away. Now, this is the reason why I hesitated in the first place. So, we haven't spoken to our dad since I was like 16. We even considered getting a restraining order from him at one point. He's not our biological father, but we were legally adopted by him when I was 9. He was physically and verbally abusive to our mum and had actually started to do the same thing with me. It got to the point where we had to leave in the middle of the night, in fact, and after this he became very controlling and would secretly follow us and record me and my sister. He has a criminal record as well, and I do believe that he was convicted of manslaughter in the 80s. I have no idea of the backstory behind that, and I honestly don't want to know, but like I said, we haven't heard from him since, so as soon as she said the word dad, I almost had a panic attack. I asked her to describe him, and she said that because it was dark out, she couldn't really see him. And in the end, we ended up staying with her because me and my sister were really shaken up. I don't know whether to call the police or not, and I'm really lost on this one. I don't know if it's our dad or not, as it could easily just be somebody else, but I sure would appreciate some advice. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this one. So, me and my friend were walking towards a park to just go and hang out, and we discovered this sewer system. We decided to check it out because we were stupid, and there was a grate covering it, but the bars were bent open enough that me and her could squeeze in. She had a really bad feeling about it. She's a super intuitive person when it comes to paranormal stuff, but I just kind of ignored it and went further in. Now, there was this big room area that the grate led into, and it had a grate on the top where the light was shining through. There was a big tunnel leading right, and a small tunnel up high that I couldn't reach on the left. The room was partially filled with water at the bottom, and there was some graffiti on the walls of the tunnel. As I looked to the left, it was super dark, so I couldn't see very well, but a long ways down there was another grate, and there was some light leaking in. And it was at this stage that I could barely make out some sort of a long, lanky thing stretched out that looked like a really skinny arm. I couldn't see a body attached to it because it was further away from me where it was darker, and I could only see it because it was in front of the light. so it was kind of shining behind it and made it pop out. Sorry if that's worded weird, but I don't know how else to describe it. All you need to know, though, is that I could see a part of it, but not the other part. And it looked like an arm stretched out, and it wasn't moving. I just kind of ignored it, thinking that it may just be a plank of wood or something propped up, because there were some planks of wood in the room that I was in. I decided to stack some rocks by the left tunnel so that I could reach it and look in. And as I looked through the tunnel, there was another room far beyond the tunnel, and it had a grate on top like my room, and the light was leaking in also. But then, I noticed this grey hunched-over figure with an extremely bony body. It didn't have any clothes or hair from what I could see anyway. Its body looked super malnourished. I couldn't see its head or its legs since the tunnel was really small. All I could really see was its back, part of its neck, and the tops of its arms. It wasn't moving, and by this point, obviously I was freaking out. I went to my friend and told her what I saw. I asked for a phone so that I could take a picture to show her since she refused to go back into there, and I took the picture and then we hightailed it out of there. Sadly, I don't have the pictures anymore because the phone it was taken on had actually gotten lost at some stage in my life. We've gone back a couple of times to try and get more pictures, but never saw anything like it since. The tunnels were just empty. But after some research, I must say that I think the figures were either crawlers or greys, or maybe something like that. If anyone has any information on greys, then please let me know, because I can't really find much about them. Again, sorry if this is badly worded, but I'm not the best writer and it's super late here. If anyone needs me to elaborate on something though, I would be happy to do so in the comments below. Also, if you have any idea of what it was or have a similar experience, then I would love to know. Thanks for listening. I was 18, living in college dorms several hours from home and working as a waitress at an upscale bar and restaurant. I'm short, barely 5 foot in fact, so I'm used to people being creepy and trying to intimidate me now, but as an 18-year-old whose father had tried to protect her from the world and had been raised in a tiny, friendly town, it never occurred to me to be scared of the people who lurk in the dark. So, we had plenty of regulars, several of whom I became close with during my years working there, and a few of the frequent diners learned my name and general facts about me, since I'm generally pretty open about who I am. One such man was tall, lanky, and several decades older, appearing to be in his mid-50s, I would guess. Joe. Joe was kind, a good man with a generous nature who owned a local shoe shop. The second time I was his waitress, he gifted me a pair of slightly worn work shoes, insisted that I accept them. Because of his kindness and the way that he carried himself, people of all types flocked to him, and one of them became the first man outside of my family that I actually feared. Joe came in with his younger brother one day, about the same height, slightly a bulkier build, and not unattractive as I recall, but his eyes just always unsettled me. In high school, I sort of fancied myself a bit of a writer, but nothing in my vocabulary then or now could help me describe just how unsettling his gaze was. It seemed almost dead, lifeless, but I assumed that I was just simply nervous. I mean, Joe was a good man. His brother was probably just less carefree and more intense or something. The two dined together a few times in the coming weeks, but while Joe would normally request me as a server, he asked our host to assign one of the other servers to his table after the first time. Then, one night, Joe's brother came in alone and requested me by name, and I was happy to oblige. For the first time, he seemed relaxed, energetic, charismatic even. He was interesting, with a quick wit and a story for every topic that I could throw at him. By the end of the shift, I assumed that he just had a hard time relaxing with his brother, and that may have been true, but through the laughter and the charisma, his eyes never once seemed kind. They remained, through it all, lifeless. Eventually, though, it was time for me to leave, but he was still there, still expecting service, so my manager offered to take over the table. He'd make sure I got the tip, but it was common knowledge that I had an early morning class and likely had to do my homework. So I jumped at the chance, but went to finish some closing duties and asked the man at my last table if he needed anything else. He seemed off too. As soon as I said that I was heading home, he seemed to sort of harden. His face was clipped and sort of reminded me of my controlling ex-stepdad, which immediately put me on edge. I'd seen the same thing often enough as a little girl right before being hit, so I left immediately. I called my best friend and offered to buy him dinner if he'd meet me at the diner between the dorms and my work. I don't know why I did, but I just felt that I needed someone to meet me sooner rather than later. Joe's brother hadn't in any way seemed dangerous outside of the tenseness in his voice before I left, but I knew that for most of my walk, which would have been poorly lit, I would be safer with a companion. So we met at the diner, we ate and laughed and headed back to the dorms. A good 25-minute walk, but only 15 or so in, the hairs on the back of my neck just seemed to burn. Something was really terrifying me, and I couldn't figure out why. I told my friend, who brushed it off until he looked behind me and yelled. I turned, and that's when I saw him, Joe's brother, only a few yards behind us, holding a metal bar. I don't know what they're called, but you see them at the construction sites, usually for reinforcement when pouring concrete and whatnot, and he was holding it hard enough that his knuckles were white. It terrified me, obviously, and I screamed. My friend grabbed my arm, and we just booked it. And even though my heart was in my throat and I couldn't hear anything past the blood roaring in my ears, I swear that I could hear his footsteps behind us. We ran to the dorms, and I told the security, who had us wait in the office while he looked at the cameras in the lot and called the police. The cops showed, but they did nothing since all that he did technically was scare us. After they left, the security man asked us a few more questions and made a comment about a man standing at the entrance door for a bit before walking away. He assumed he was homeless, but my blood ran cold. I called in sick for a few days, and when I went back to work, Joe was in. I told him what had happened, and he nodded, didn't even seem to question the validity of what I said. His brother, it turned out, had done some time for stalking and even attacking young women, and had even been sent to trial for assaulting one and hospitalizing her. Somehow he had managed to avoid jail time for the assault, but Joe said that it was only a matter of time before he actually killed someone. I didn't see Joe often after that, and I never did see his brother again. The owner of the restaurant was angry for a long time, accused me of running off a regular who spent a lot of money when he came in. It took me a few more encounters to make me a little more cynical, but Joe's brother, he was the one to break me out of my naivety. I came over from Serbia at age 13 with my mother. My older brother, who was 15 years older than me, had lived in America for a few years, and he sent for us. My mum wouldn't be staying, although at the time I wasn't aware of that. But we landed in New York City, and the plan was that my brother would come and get us. However, my niece decided to come early, and my brother's wife went into labor shortly before we landed. My brother couldn't leave his wife, obviously, so he asked a co-worker of his, they drove cabs, to pick us up in New York City and drive us to New Jersey, where him and my sister-in-law lived. When we got to New York City, we waited in customs for what seemed like forever. We looked for my brother, but we didn't see him. This was the early 90s, and cell phones weren't as commonplace, and even if they were, my mum didn't have them. So we panicked a bit, not seeing my brother or my sister-in-law, when suddenly we heard our names being called and saw a tall man. He introduced himself in perfect Serbian and explained that he was a good friend of my brother's, and then told us about the baby. And he said that he'd be driving us the 2 hours from the airport to my brother's home. My mum finally relaxed, and they happily began to converse about the baby and my brother in America. I, however, just felt off. This guy gave me bad vibes, and regardless of my brother's friendship with him, I felt distrustful of him. We drove for a good hour, though, and a half, when he announced that he was going to take us out for breakfast. We hadn't eaten in like 15 hours, so we were starving by then. We pulled up to a house, and my mum and I were really confused. He insisted cheerfully that his wife was cooking us breakfast, and after we would drive the rest of the way to the hospital to see my family. My mum shushed me when I whispered something didn't feel right, and told me that we needed to be grateful for the hospitality. And so we were led into the house. It was really dark and dank and sort of dirty, and suddenly, I think my mum finally got a bit nervous and started insisting that he take us to my brother. Suddenly, the guy grabbed my mum by the wrist. He told her that he needed a wife to take care of him in his house, and when he heard my brother tell the others at work that she'd be coming to stay, he knew that he'd found a wife. I, at the time, was a scrawny little scamp of a kid, and I tried pushing him off my mum, but he hit me so hard that I just saw stars. At this point, we were terrified, and neither of us really spoke English. We only knew my brother's home number, and he was at the hospital. Also, in Serbia, you don't dial 911, so even if I could, I didn't know that that was how I could call the police anyway. So he tells my mum that she's to clean and cook for him, and he takes me to the basement where I was locked in what I now know is called the laundry room. I banged and cried and yelled, but it was so far down in the basement that everything was muffled. For a week we were kept in this, and for a whole week we were kept in his home. He would lock us up in the basement after my mum cooked him breakfast, and he'd let us out when he would come home at 4. If we had to use the restroom, there was a bathroom, but that was it. Just a bathroom and a laundry room. It was freezing cold down there, and even us huddling together under a blanket did basically nothing. One morning, though, I discovered a small window by climbing on some boxes. I managed to open it, and my mother insisted that I squeeze through it. I didn't want to leave her, and besides, how would I get help if I couldn't read or speak the language? But I didn't want to live this way the rest of my life, so I did what she asked. I ran once I got out, and I'm sure that I was a sight. A scrawny boy with no shoes, only wearing shorts and a t-shirt in the middle of November. However, that is what saved us, as several concerned neighbours tried to get me to come to them, and I wouldn't. I was so terrified. I kept trying to get them to follow me. The police were called, and a very nice policeman tried to get me to go into his car. And then I saw the man who'd taken us drive up in his taxi. He saw the cops, and he just took off. That was when I made a run for his house to get my mum, and needless to say, the cop and his partner ran after me, and my mother was rescued. It took about another 4 hours for them to find someone who spoke our language for us to tell them what happened. A warrant was issued for the man. My brother was contacted. His friend had told him that we never showed up, and my brother had been frantically calling back home in Serbia to find us. He drove up to get us and to give the cops information on his supposed friend so they could find him. But they never did. Back then, before 911, it was easy for someone to disappear. However, it made me very distrustful for a long time of people and their intentions. My mum grew homesick eventually as well, and she ended up going back to Serbia. I stayed and I finished school, and I ended up becoming a cop in the military, thanks to the nice officer that helped me all those years ago. So this took place when I was fairly young. I can't exactly pinpoint an age because this was a more persistent phenomenon that went on for quite a while. Roughly though, from when I was maybe 5 to 10 years old, I would guess. I lived in a smaller community at the time, and there was a river that my group of friends used to play near to, and several other bodies of water, mainly small streams and ponds and stuff like that. But we also often played in a nearby forest, as kids do, I suppose. We were in groups of 8 at most, and maybe 2 or 3 at least. We did typical kid stuff and grew pretty familiar with the part of the forest that we played in. Now, I have some very vivid memories spanning from almost as long as I can remember to when my family moved away about someone calling my name. This was especially often when I was with a smaller group of friends. The voices were sometimes my parents or neighbors or someone I didn't recognize, but they were definitely adult voices, if that makes sense. For instance, I would hear my dad calling my name several times, even though he was at work. Sometimes it was in another country, in fact. My house is definitely out of earshot too from the area that I played in, and my mum was often preoccupied with looking after my sister or her work. And the point is that she definitely wasn't the one calling me either. I was a really obedient child as well, a bit of a goody two-shoes, I suppose. I would usually always obey when adults told me to do something or come to them when they called me. And it definitely sounded as if these voices were trying to lure me away from my group. My friends said that they never heard the voices when I asked, so I stuck to the group and continued whatever game that we were playing. This would usually happen in the forest, but sometimes also when we played near the river as well. And the voices just came from directions that never really made sense. Deeper into the woods, closer to the river, away from my house, away from my group. And they never did say anything but my name, even when I called back to them. I rarely ever went to this place alone, but sometimes I'd feel like I was just being watched, even though nobody was there. Sometimes I got the urge to run away out of the forest, and I never ignored it, just dropped everything and started running. I don't know how relevant this information is too, but I know that a young boy drowned in that river that we used to play at in the time frame this phenomenon happened to me. I realize that this all sounds a bit silly and just something that kids do or imagine, but I used to see things a lot as a kid as well. Mostly when I was really young. My parents said I'd often come to them and speak about angels or fairies or something that I met in the tall grass or near the woods. They sometimes heard me talking to thin air, as kids do, I suppose. I definitely did not have an imaginary friend, but I do have vague memories of seeing these things too. Sometimes they scared me, but a lot of the time they didn't. The voices in the forest also didn't sound scary every time, but they always weirded me out because I didn't know what kept calling. This phenomenon, though, it stopped after my family moved and I stopped playing in those woods, which is really strange. But I recently went back to the area for nostalgia's sake, and I didn't hear the voices, but for some reason the place just gave me a massive headache, and my friend and I went back earlier than planned. There was still this area that really creeped me out as well. As kids we called it the dark side. A bit cringy, I know, but we were very little, and it was a part of the forest that we never really entered. I remember too that I always just walked around it as a kid. But anyway, what do you guys think about all this? Do you think that something was actually calling my name from the forest? Or is it all just in my head? In December of 2013, during my sophomore year of college, my at-the-time boyfriend, David, had a fraternity dinner banquet that I attended with him. It was a nice event, requiring everyone to dress up. He was in a suit, I was in dress and heels. It's important for later, so that's why I mention it. But we had a pretty good time, and then we went back to his place to drop off the award David won and change into tacky Christmas sweaters for a party that we had later that night. It was maybe 7:30, but given that it was December, it was already pretty dark out when we pulled into the parking lot outside of David's apartment. At his place, there was one road with parking on either side, spots against the building and spots against a fence that lined the edge of the complex property. We parked in a fence spot with the trunk of our car facing the building, directly across from the stair leading up to David's door. Maybe 30 feet from safety, I would guess. David and I got out, though, and we went to the trunk to get his award when a man started to approach us. Dave noticed him and said, "What's up, man?" The man said nothing and just kept walking towards us. As he got closer, I could see that he was wearing baggy black sweatpants and a camo hoodie. He had the hood on and the drawstrings were pulled tight, so I could only see about half of his face. Both of his hands were in the front of his hoodie pocket, though. David said again, "What's up?" This time, the man answered, "Get up against the car." Confused, I said, "Wait, what?" And the man pulled a gun out of his hoodie pocket. "I said, get up against the car!" David got against the back of the car while the man put the gun against his back. I was in utter shock that this was happening, so I took a step back, now trapped between two cars, a fence, and a man holding a gun to my boyfriend. He told David to give him all the money that we had, but we both really only used cards and never had cash on us. Unfortunately, though, while home for Thanksgiving, his parents had given him $200 in 20s, all of which went into the hands of our mug. Then he turned to me, pointed the gun at my face, less than a foot away, and said, "Your turn." I was dressed up and only carrying a small clutch purse. I literally only had a phone and lip gloss on me. I stammered out that I didn't have anything while staring at the gun he had pointed at me. He then went back to my boyfriend. At this point, I feel my blood start to boil. I was becoming less frightened and more pissed off, outraged that this man was aggressively stealing from two broke college kids. I mean, how dare he treat other people like this? Couldn't he tell that we were coming from an event and he was going to ruin our night? I wanted to kick him in the big clunky heels so badly, but thankfully I realized that would probably just piss him off more. So instead, I grabbed my phone, keeping my hand in my purse, and tried to dial 911. Unfortunately, my purse was too small to hide any movement, and I was worried if he saw me trying to call for help that he would shoot. So in the end, I just kind of stood there, staring at the gun being pressed into David's back. Finally, he took David's wallet and car keys and threw them in one direction, ran off in the other, hopping the fence separating the apartment complex from a small neighborhood. David and I just kind of stood there in silence for a second, trying to grasp what just happened. We slowly gathered his keys and wallet and then went inside and called the police, definitely in shock. But this is where the story gets really interesting. So the police had an officer patrolling the other side of the apartment complex. It was a group of about 26 buildings. We were in 26 and the cop was over near one. And the police were there because they'd gotten a call from a previous day about the same guy mugging someone over there. The police and the detectives came over and took our story and asked us questions for about an hour. When they left, it was still relatively early, maybe like 9 p.m. We were still shaken up, but David and I decided that we'll still go to the tacky Christmas party that we'd planned on attending, thinking that it would help us take our mind off of this horrible encounter. Our friend was hosting a pre-game at his apartment in the building 3 of the same complex. Even though we decided not to drink that night, we head over after getting into our tacky sweaters. The pre-game got a little bit rowdy and we heard a loud knock on the door. We open it to see the person who lives next door to our friend. He said, "Hey guys, you might want to keep it down. I don't want anyone getting in trouble. I have the police and an investigator at my apartment right now because I was mugged out here last night. I heard 2 people got mugged tonight, so please be safe, yeah?" And David and I looked at each other, then back at him. "Oh, hi, actually, that was us. We're the 2 that were mugged tonight. It's nice to meet you, fellow mugging victim." He laughed and shook our hands. The neighbor and David compared knives that they were now carrying as personal defense weapons before we went back to his place. Later on down the road, David and I had broken up, but the security at the complex was amped up. More lights were installed in the parking lot, and my girlfriend and I moved in. We had to park in the same set of spots where I was held at gunpoint. Probably a stupid way to face your fears, but we didn't have any issues while we lived there, thankfully. In the end, though, this guy that mugged us, apparently, was never caught. I'm a 21-year-old male. It was July 4th of 2019, and I live in Kansas in the USA. At the time, I worked as a corrections officer at a maximum security prison on the night shift. The cell house that I was in charge of was the maximum general population, 1 man to a cell, and this is where all the bad guys were held, and overall, the worst of society were housed here. Before work, I was doing the typical American 4th of July thing, grilling, blowing up fireworks, had a beer or 2, having a great time with my now wife and family as well. My wife kept telling me that I needed to just call in sick and take the day without pay. I said no because, well, we're a little behind on bills. But boy, do I really wish that I'd listened to her now. As the night went on, it came time for us to leave my mum's and for me to go home and get ready for work. I took my wife home and dropped her off, got ready, and I left for work. My wife's car was actually broken, so she was stuck at home for the night. As I drove to work, which was about an hour's drive away, I watched the fireworks going off all around. It was kind of sad as well, because I never had to work on the 4th before, but this was a first. But after I got to work and got all my equipment, I got into my cell house. Business as usual, inmates were showered and locked up. I got my night cleaning crew out so they could clean the rest of the cell house, and met up with my partner for the night in the officer station to get our briefing from the last shift. Fast forward an hour into our shift. It's now right around 12:30. Another officer came into the cell house, so now there's 3 of us. This happened often on night shift, as there was nothing to do except rounds every half an hour or so. When out of nowhere, we hear an inmate laughing like a witch, like a cackle. That was strange, but nothing to be alarmed with. Drugs were a huge problem in this facility. Still is, in fact, as far as I know. But eventually, after a few more cackles, I decided to go and see what was making the sound in case they were high or something. I walked through and checked all 200 inmates, and nothing. There were a small few that were even awake, so I just kind of brushed it off and I just went back to my office. My partner and the other officer were asking if there was anyone that needed their cell searched. I couldn't think of anyone in particular that I suspected of having anything, so I went and checked all the cells again to see if I could get a whiff of smoke or see something. And as I was walking on the 2nd-story cell run, I found an inmate that was acting really weird. He was in his bed facing the wall, just talking. This was kind of common too, as there are a lot of inmates with minor mental health issues. I figured that he must have been high because he turned and looked at me and told me to F off. I was going to leave him alone, but the disrespect made me kind of change my mind. And the time is now 12:40, July 5th. I walk back to the office and tell the other 2 officers which cell that he was in, and I wanted him searched, cell 218. So, how the cell house is laid out is there are 100 cells per level. But from the officer station you can see the north side, 1st and 2nd floor, but you can't see the south side unless you walk the 50 feet over it. Picture the movie Shawshank Redemption type cell house, except instead of being able to look through and see the cells across, you just see a wall. The cells are literally back to back. So, as the officers go to pull him out of his cell to search it, I went to the ground floor and was watching from below. Reason why? I wanted to get the inmate on the ground level and not the 2nd floor. All that was there for protection from going over the edge was a handrail. And I noticed the inmate was taking forever to get out of his cell. He came out in shorts and a do-rag, which is weird because he wasn't fully clothed, didn't even put on sandals, just shorts and a do-rag, yet took 5 minutes to get out. And that made me really nervous. The inmate was a 6-foot-tall, 250-pound, muscle-bound dude, too. Definitely had size on us. So from the ground, I holler at him and tell him to come down to the ground and that he could use the phone or check his email or commissary or something. And he declined my offer, which never happens. I knew something was up at that point. He was watching them search his cell from the control panel box, and this was alarming. They were in his cell and I was on the ground. He could have easily ambushed them, and he would have made it to them before I could get up the stairs. So, to try and keep them safe, I went upstairs to the inmate. He was standing in the corner away against the handrails at the top of the stairs. He knew that I was the OIC, officer in charge of that cell house, and he knew that I was the one that saw him talking to himself, and he asked me why I was having his cell searched. I lied, and I said, it's nothing personal, man. I have a quota that I have to fill for cells searched in a night, and you were awake, so I just chose you to have it searched. It'll just take a second, don't worry. He was uneasy. He was pacing. Something just wasn't right. And then I saw it. He had turned just right, and I saw in his do-rag the Samsung logo reflecting the cell house light. Shit. I knew that there was going to be a problem as soon as I saw it, because he had a cell phone. I called over the radio for 2 additional officers to come to me. The inmate didn't seem to notice that I made the call. My supervisors responded saying 2 of them were on their way. Side note too, that at this time, only segregation officers had protective vests. So, out of the 5 of us that were now in there, only 1 had a vest. And I was not one of them. The officers there were South, he had a vest, McCormick, Collins, Sheffield, and me. The time is now 12:58, and as soon as South and McCormick got up to me, I told the inmate to turn around and to cuff up. South and McCormick were on the inmate's right side, I was in front of him, and he said, "Why?" angrily. I refused to give him a reason at first, and after a few minutes I had had enough. So I told him, "Look man, I can see the cell phone in your do-rag. You know you're not supposed to have that." The inmate then gets a defeated look on his face, but then fire in his eyes. His body relaxes and he slowly reaches up to retrieve the phone. But does he pull out a phone? No. He pulls out a 6-inch sharpened metal rod with ripped fabric wrapped around the bottom of the handle. Everything froze for me. I knew right then that I was about to die. Everything starts moving again, and I now have an inmate twice my size, charging and thrusting quickly and repeatedly towards me. I immediately went into defensive mode, trying to grab his arm and disarm him. His wrist kept slipping, and I couldn't keep a hold of it, but at the very least, I thankfully managed to block his attempts at my lower abdomen. Suddenly, though, he aimed high and went for my chest. I felt it make contact too, and I had just been stabbed in the right part of my chest. I yelled, "Spray him," at the top of my lungs. McCormick was already working on it. But for those who don't understand, MK9 comes as a pressured spray bottle, about 20 ounces I think, and you can buy it at a camping store in the US, and it's called bear spray. It's the stuff that you spray in bears' eyes so that you can get away. South had come up behind the inmate and grabbed him around his chest and pulled him backwards, right as McCormick sprayed. I didn't realize it at the time, but the spray actually hit me, the inmate, and South, as well as everyone near us. I was able to turn and run, and I ran around the stair railing, past the panel box, and out onto the run of the cells on the 2nd story. I ran past a few cells and turned around to see that he wasn't chasing me, but South was wrestling him onto the ground while gagging on the OC, as was I and McCormick. Sheffield, having heard the commotion, came running out of the cell, saw what was happening, and ran in to help. The inmate, though, grabbed South by the vest and tried to throw him over the end of the landing, but South dropped to his knees before he went over. I grabbed my shoulder mic and I screamed into it, a level A response to "Charlie, now." The dispatch said something back, but I didn't hear it. I started to charge back to help save South, but before I could get away from the cell, I was in front of Collins, and he grabbed me from behind and told me to not go. Due to the layout of the runs, I didn't see, but Sheffield grabbed the inmate from behind and body slammed him on his face, and thankfully, he began to cuff him. Sheffield got covered in OC as well, due to the inmate being covered in it, and as soon as Collins let me go, I stood still and I watched. Up the stairs came 4 more officers, the captain and a lieutenant. The lieutenant came and asked me what happened, and I started to explain, but he cut me off after he saw blood coming out of my left arm. After taking me out of the cell house, he made me lift my shirt because he saw the blood. He examined all my wounds, and he had to remove all of my equipment and old paper towels to my arm. I was rushed to the ER, and I was able to grab my phone out of my rental car. I had actually totaled my car a few weeks prior by hitting a deer. I called my wife, and I told her what happened, and she called my parents and siblings. Luckily, my injuries weren't too bad. I was stabbed 4 times, once on my left arm just below the elbow. That was through and through. Blade went into one side and out the other, twice in the top of my left hand, and the one that hit my chest went into my skin but hit one of my ribs, keeping it out of my lungs, thankfully. And after 37 plunges, I think it's safe to say that I'm lucky to be here to even write this story. I didn't sleep for 2 days following the event, and I still have nightmares almost daily about it. I'm always paranoid, and I openly carry a gun. After my attack, I was forced to resign for safety reasons. Everyone statewide that works in max prisons now has vests, and none of the people from there talk to me anymore. I must say that I really feel abandoned. I have one guy from that facility that I still see, my sergeant who wasn't there that night. Court is coming soon to add 3 more attempted murders on this guy, and it turns out that he was a shot caller for the Crips gang. Anyway, stay safe out there, everyone, and if any law enforcement listens to this, always watch your six and never be afraid to ask for backup. So, I've heard some stories recently about human trafficking, and it got me thinking about this experience that I had last summer. So I, 18, female, 17 at the time, went to the convenience store near my house to get a Slurpee at around 9 or 10 p.m. I was walking up to the doors and I noticed 3 middle-aged men standing near the doors just kind of talking. There was an older lady struggling to open the door to leave, so as I came in, I opened it for her. As I walked into the store, she stopped and said thank you and blah blah blah. But this is when it started to get really weird. So she asked me how old I was and what school I went to. Then she asked me where I lived. I replied with, oh, I live in this town. But she was insistent on knowing where my house was. I started to get creeped out, so I pretended to get a call from my boyfriend, which I didn't have, and answered like, oh, hey babe, I'm just at Circle K near my house and I'll be over in 15. After I answered the call, she hurried out of the store and went up to those 3 men that were standing by the entrance. I got my Slurpee and then I literally ran to my car. I looked out of my window and the 3 men and the old lady got into a vehicle. I unfortunately can't remember what the make was, and started driving in my direction. Well, I noped the hell out of that parking lot and I drove away. I drove a bit down the road and then I noticed that they were definitely following me. So I turned into the Walmart parking lot and they continued forward. I'm hoping that it was just a coincidence that they were going in the same direction that I was. The whole situation felt really off and really creepy. The fact that they followed me and only went past me after I stopped and they kind of knew that I knew that they were following really creeps me out. This all happened about 7.5 years ago, I think, when I was 13. My grandmother was in the hospital with pneumonia. By the time that my family got there was about 11 or 15 of us. Yeah, it's a lot, but 5 out of the 8 children were with their families. After a little while, though, they told us that we needed to leave so they could give her some shots and whatnot. At the time, we didn't know that there was a waiting room on the floor, so my uncle suggested that we go down to the first floor so we could sit in the waiting room or whatever it was. We had to go down 2 separate elevators since there were so many of us, and once we got down there, we saw 2 nurses hiding behind a door. And when we asked what was wrong, they said, nothing, you can still go in there. So we walked in. It was about 2 p.m. on a Sunday. There was no one in there and the lights were off. And yes, in retrospect, we should have just turned around and walked back out, but like all white people in horror movies, I suppose, we didn't think anything of it. We met up with the rest of the family, and that's when we noticed 2 other guys. The first man was sitting with his hands behind his back. The second one was standing behind him, holding his wrists together. The man sitting was staring daggers right at me, and after about 10 minutes of sitting and staring, a third man in a hospital security uniform came up and asked if we saw anything. Visibly confused, we said no, and they told us that we needed to leave. We went back to the 4th floor and found the waiting room, and it was right next to the psych ward with a sign that said stay clear, there's a high chance of flight risk. Now, you might be thinking, what's so scary about that? A random guy was staring at a 13-year-old girl. Ha ha. Well, a little while later, we found out exactly what happened. The man that was sitting on his hands, restrained, was a junkie looking for a quick fix. He had walked in and was told that he couldn't get any drugs without a medical reason. So he pulled out a knife and stabbed the woman at the reception in the neck. Why we were allowed in that room with this man while the hospital was supposedly in lockdown, I'll never understand. I also have no clue where the police were in this whole situation. But this story does kind of have a happy ending, for the woman at least. About 2 years ago, this incident was brought up at a family gathering, and my cousin said that the woman, she actually survived. She no longer works for the hospital and has a lot of difficulties resulting from her injury, but she was working as a secretary for a school or something. Anyway, it was a really strange experience, and one thing I'll never forget are those eyes that, honestly, were shooting daggers at me. So, this happened to me last week, on Sunday evening. Every Friday, I go to see my boyfriend, who doesn't live in the same city as me, but in the city next to mine. It takes an hour by car to get to his place, and I don't have a driver's license because I live in a big city, and I don't need a car to go to my university and my job. I just use the subway. Now, you have to know that it's been really difficult to travel by train in France right now because of all the strikes and whatnot, so a lot of people just travel thanks to carpooling. We have a very famous app to travel like this. It costs less and it's easier to travel as well, so most people use it. I've used this app for almost 1.5 years now, and I've never really had any problems. But last Sunday, I go into the app to book a carpool with a woman in her late 40s. I would rather travel with a woman because I'm a girl, 21 years old, and I think it's safer to take a car with a woman. But this time, it definitely wasn't. So I booked my carpool, and she wrote me her personal number. When you book a carpool, the person who posted the ad has access to your phone number if they accept your request, to let me know that she would come and pick me up at 6:20 p.m. So I go to the meeting place and I'm getting in her car. I immediately notice that she's acting a little bit strange, but I didn't pay it too much attention. As I said, it's only an hour by car to get myself home. What could happen to me? There were no other passengers too, so I was feeling pretty comfortable. So I'm scrolling on my phone and I wasn't watching the road. When you take the carpool, the principle is that the driver takes the highway and does not leave it until we arrive to the destination. Nobody ever gets off the highway, and it's really weird if someone does that because it's the person who booked the carpool who paid for the toll and whatnot. So there's really no reason to not do it. 30 minutes later though, and I notice that we're already at the toll, and I start to watch all over but didn't recognize the toll of my city. I realized then that she got off long before the freeway exits that she was supposed to take. I don't know why, but my survival instinct was pretty much immediately awoken. I took a screenshot of the conversation that I had with her earlier in the day, with her phone number, and sent it to my boyfriend and my half-sister, telling them that if I'm not replying and if they don't have any news from me in an hour, to call the cops. I also turned on my GPS, just in case. Then I asked her what she was doing. Excuse me, why are you leaving the highway? We're not in the right place. And she started to act stranger than before. Yes, I know. I just want to visit this village with you. What? Why? I don't want to go there. I've paid you to drive me to my city. I'm not here to visit anyone with you. Can you please just drive me to my destination? She started to leave the village at some point and took some really dark and creepy road. Don't be afraid, she replied. I just want to spend some time with you. What? I'm not here to spend time with you. There are less than 500 people who live here. There's nothing to do here. Please, just take me to my destination. She said that she takes this road because there's too much traffic elsewhere. I text my boyfriend what she just said to me. He goes on the traffic website and told me that there's absolutely no traffic where I was supposed to go, which means that she's definitely lying. My heart starts to beat faster, and then I decide to pressure her. I have no idea how it came in my mind, but this is what I told her. Listen, lady, you will drive me where you're supposed to, alright? I warned my boyfriend and my sister that you're acting weird. They know where I am, and furthermore, my father is working for Interpol. That's International Criminal Police Organization. And I'm about to text him if you don't take me where I'm supposed to go. And let me tell you that he will definitely find me. She immediately starts to become really anxious and starts to insult me, but she went back to the highway. She didn't know that what I said wasn't totally true. My father really was working for Interpol for more than 10 years, but he actually quit his job when I was about 4 or 5 to go start a new life in another country with my mother, brother, and me as well, after my mother left him because he was violent. He actually left us behind, and I don't talk to him anymore. He's a really toxic person. A good cop, but a really bad person. Violent, alcoholic, a liar. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, she drives me to my destination and asks me to get out of the car right after we pass the toll. And I didn't want to spend any more time with her, and I was glad to be safe. I got home safely eventually, and I immediately contacted the application support service, and they wrote me back, thanked me for warning them, and a few days later, they sent me another email telling me that they're sorry and that they're going to erase her profile. I know that nothing happened to me in the end, which I'm grateful for, believe me, but it was a really creepy situation. I don't know where she was taking me and what she was planning to do, and I'm really glad that I came up with the lie that I did to get out of that situation. Although my father will never know, he maybe saved me that day. So, I, a 20-year-old female, lived in a really shady as hell apartment complex in an otherwise rich suburban area for 3 years, and have a lot of stories that would fit here, believe me. But this one is about a neighbour that I'll call Bob. So, me, 18 at the time, and my then 16-year-old sister used to babysit all the neighbourhood kids. These kids considered us their friends, and it got to where they seemed to have a sort of radar of when me and my sister were outside. They'd come out and talk to us, and we'd let them ride our skateboards and such in the parking lot. The kids were ages about 8 to 13, I would guess. So one day, we were outside with them, and we were joined by a stranger. He stood between us and our car, towering over us. He introduced himself and asked us to sign a petition that he made. We did, just being friendly. Then he asked us how old we were. I thought maybe he was a fellow teenager that looked older, or that maybe he was just being awkward. So I told him that I was 18, and the very next question was if I wanted to go out with him. It was in front of my mum and the other kid's mum too. I awkwardly declined, but he continued talking about how he thought me and my sister were in middle school. Also, he was apparently 28. Eventually, though, he wandered away to ask someone else to sign his petition. A few days later, he knocked on our door after asking a neighbour for the address. He had a bag of what he said was chicken and wanted us to go and eat it with him at the park or something. We declined because we both had schoolwork to do, and he walked away, and he was mumbling about how antisocial everyone was. Later, we look out our window and see him playing baseball with 2 girls. He kept physically moving their arms to different positions, even though they shrugged him away from him. Next day, one of the kids runs up to me, and I'll call her Maddie. She's 8. She's got a new pair of Heelys and wanted help with them. I was holding her hand and guiding her along when Bob appears and says that he can help better. Maddie says no, but he insists. He pushed me aside and reaches for Maddie, holding her tightly around the upper chest area. Her grandma was there too and flips out, and he eventually wanders off. The next day, Maddie is freaking out, saying Bob was just sitting on her porch when she left for school that morning. Her parents found out, and as they walked outside, he just let himself in, and they said that he went to their kitchen to make orange chicken. We later found out another neighbour had a similar story as well. Another time, we were helping a family move. They have a 2-year-old son. The garages are in a triangle shape to the road, almost sort of like a roundabout. There's a flat patch of grass behind them, and, well, here comes Bob to help us. He criticised the way that we packed things and didn't help, until our neighbour politely asked him to leave. Well, he left the garage, but instead of leaving, he asked the 2-year-old if he wanted to play. The kid said no, and that made him mad, apparently. He picked up the kid to play, and the kid eventually slapped him. He asked the kid again if he wanted to go behind the garages to play ball, and the kid's mum doesn't notice, so I go with them and guide the kid to his mum. But the climax of this story is when me and my sister went on a walk with our 17-year-old friend and her other friend. Maddie found us too and wanted to come along as well. So we're starting out when Bob comes out. He sees our friend and asks how old she is and how much she weighs because she's so skinny. He asks where we're going, and my friend tells him that we're going for ice cream on a girls' trip. We didn't ask her to say that. He's like, "Oh man," and sort of stomps away. We continue our walk, but halfway through we have a really weird feeling. I look behind us, and Bob is running towards us. He yells at us for hiding from him while also telling Maddie about how pretty she is. An older neighbor sees this and asks him what's going on. He tells the man that we're being mean and he needs to go write a song about us. He leaves, but we see him sitting at the park and, well, he saw us and again comes running. We stop and he asks which one of us is over 18. Maddie's dad is here at this point and tells him that we aren't interested in him. He explodes at this point, telling the dad to fuck himself and that he's so rude. Then he called me a bitch. Maddie's crying, and the neighbor who saw us before came to check on us since he saw Bob running, and Bob eventually goes inside, muttering to himself again. For weeks, we actually don't see him. A single dad and his 5-year-old daughter move in, and we're introducing ourselves to them, and my mum kind of tips him off that there's someone in their building who's a little off, especially around Maddie. The dad says that he's seen someone like that giving kids candy at the pool, and the kids looked uncomfortable. Well, here comes Bob, as if on cue. He immediately tells the girl, in front of her dad too, that she looks like a movie star and that she's so pretty. He asks to play with her, but the dad says no and they go inside. Turns out they were next-door neighbors, which was very unfortunate for them. We still didn't see him much after that, but other neighbors were telling us stories about him. There's a woman who's alone most of the day with her 2 kids under 5 who told us that he watches her when she goes to and from her car. Also, Maddie's parents continued to see him watching her as well. And then one day, we're again just babysitting, and here he comes again. Only this time, he's swinging nunchucks around. Maddie screams and hides in our car. Bob strolls over with his nunchucks and starts talking to us all casually. Then his head cranes to look into the car and he says, "Where's Maddie?" We told him that she wasn't here and he walks away. By then, most of the kids were afraid to go outside when they saw him. He had a habit of wandering around the complex. We could tell by his height and lanky gait as well when he was coming. A few times we'd seen Bob with his dad, and those times, neither of them even glanced at us. And one day he just sort of stopped showing up. We'd see his dad and brother come in and out all the time, but we never saw him. We only saw him again maybe a year later, and it was only for one day near Christmas, and then he disappeared again. So I don't really know what happened to him, but it was just one of our weird experiences with the neighborhood in the 3 years that we lived there. Maybe I'll share some other stories about some chick that tried to kill her parents because she was a witch, or the old man that bites children next, if you'd like to hear them. But this story is definitely one of the ones that made me feel the most ickiest, and it was creepy. I was about 6 years old, and we had gone to a karate tournament for my older brother and father. The whole place had people from this karate club everywhere, and everyone in the club knew me as it was a pretty close-knit group. Also, this was back in the more free-range days of parenting, so I was left at one of the competitions to watch some of the people from our club compete. There was a little girl there who started to be mean to me, but her mother called her over, and soon she was sort of being sickly sweet to me and brought me to her mother to meet her. They said that they were there to watch her brother as well, but the brother was nowhere to be seen, and they didn't seem to know anyone there, which was weird. But after a while, The competition finished, and I got up saying that I had to go and find my parents. The woman then said, "Oh no, you should come and watch my son compete." She grabbed me by the wrist and started to take me with them. I told her that she was hurting my wrist, and she said that it was because she had to hold me tight since it was so crowded in there. I insisted that I needed to see my parents, and she said that she would take me to them. She began to walk towards the door to take us outside and into the parking lot when my father, thank God, stopped us. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. The woman became very indignant. "I'm taking her to her parents. They're friends of mine." My father then responded, "I'm her parent." My father was in total shock, and the woman just took off out the door before he even knew what was happening. We called the police, but nothing ever really came from it, and we never saw that woman again. And thankfully, I wasn't kidnapped that day. Years ago, when I was just becoming a teenager, my mum's half-sister, my aunt, her husband, my uncle, and their 5-year-old daughter, my cousin, had moved into my aunt's mum's house due to financial issues. My aunt's mum was dating someone at the time, so she had moved out and allowed my aunt, uncle, and cousin to move in with no problems. The house was small and kind of creepy, but it was big enough to house their family, and it was a very short distance from my house, so we got to see them quite often. However, the place was creepy, as I said. Something about it just gave younger me the chills any time that I stepped foot in there. The upstairs didn't have much access to natural light, but it was the only area with the bedrooms for my cousin, so she had her bedroom and a playroom on the second floor. The first floor was very long, but not very wide, so you basically passed through every room to either get to the living room, the sunroom, or my aunt and uncle's bedroom on the other side of the house. But the basement was terrifying. It was extremely dark and often very musty. It had one little window and then only one measly little light to illuminate the area. Supposedly, too, there was a cat down there that they kept and fed, although I never actually saw said cat. Knowing a general layout of the house is important for this story, though, and you'll understand why in a minute. So, what I was unaware of, though, is that the house was originally owned by a lady that was a caretaker of sick young kids with Down syndrome. Don't ask me how or why she took up that role, but she did, and of course, oftentimes, if the kids couldn't shake the sickness, they would sometimes die in the house. There was never a clear record to my understanding, but it was confirmed that at least 3 kids had passed away due to illness in this home. This didn't pose as a problem to my aunt and uncle, though, and they lived there for a couple of months with no issues. Until one day when just all hell broke loose. So my aunt and uncle enjoyed watching paranormal shows, even if they were seemingly completely fake. They just enjoyed seeing people venture into the unknown. However, I and my family believe now that it may have opened a portal of sorts in the house for some sort of restless spirit or something. Now, one afternoon, my cousin was homeschooled her whole life. My aunt was watching TV, and my cousin was behind the couch in an open area between the sunroom and the living room, playing with some of her toys and a little soccer ball. When, all of a sudden, she exclaimed, "Hey, give me back my ball." Knowing that there was nobody else in the house at the time, my aunt looked over the couch to my cousin and questioned who she was talking to. And what my cousin said next gives me cold chills every time I think about it. Take into consideration, too, that she's young and she's unaware of the previous history of the house. She responded to my aunt, though, that boy, he took my ball. To which my aunt asked, "What boy?" And my cousin responded, "That little boy sitting there. Don't you see him? He has a weird-looking face." Immediately, my aunt knew what she was referring to. This boy with this weird face could probably only be described as one of the kids with Down syndrome that had passed away in this house. Terrified of the situation that she was in now, my aunt calmly told my cousin, "It's okay, just be nice to him and politely ask for your ball back if you're going to play with it." She told my uncle when he came home from work that night, and they definitely became a little bit uneasy of the fact that there were possibly restless spirits appearing to my cousin. A little time passed, though, and no other new encounter seemed to be occurring. or at least my cousin wasn't vocal about them anyway. So, out of curiosity one day, my aunt asked my cousin what happened to that little boy. And I kid you not, my cousin very nonchalantly said, "Him and two of his friends visit me every night after you and Daddy put me to bed. They get mad and tell me to stop talking about them. I tried hiding from them, but they just stand and stare until I go to sleep." Now, of course, my aunt is terrified. These things are suppressing my cousin from even speaking about them now. So my aunt asks, "Do his friends look weird like he does?" To which my cousin replied, "Yeah, but I'm not allowed to talk about them, Mummy." Needless to say, after my aunt told my uncle about this interaction, they became very proactive about finding another place to live due to just fear. But these spirits had one more encounter planned, and they were eager to show their dissatisfaction apparently with my aunt and uncle's choice to remove their playmate from their home. So it was late one night. My aunt's mum had a Harley Davidson that she stored in the basement of the house, but she had taken it earlier that day and rode it to her boyfriend's house. At around 1 a.m. that night, my aunt thought that she heard the motorcycle downstairs, which was odd seeing that it was obviously so late. There was no way that her mum would be bringing home the bike or anything. But it continued and the sound didn't go away. Finally, she woke up my uncle and they called her mum. When her mum answered, they asked her if she was in the basement with her motorcycle, and she was very puzzled as she was still in another county over with her boyfriend. So they ended their call and my aunt and uncle went to investigate. And no sooner that they reached that little door that led to the basement, which was deadbolted by the way, cold chills just shot down their spines. They both swore that they heard whispers coming from the door. Terrified, but in need of answers, they slowly crept over closer to the door, and then it began violently jolting, nearly breaking the deadbolt off the wall. They jumped back and ran and grabbed my cousin, and drove to my pawpaw's house, my aunt and my mum's dad, and stayed there the rest of the night. Soon after that, they moved to another state, and we still stay in touch today. The house is currently up for auction, and man, do I pity the person who purchases it. My aunt and uncle will not get involved with anything close to the paranormal anymore, and my cousin doesn't remember anything. But it was a strange house, for sure. I remember very vividly when there were two of the same people in the same house. In the middle of the day, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I think, I was leaving the living room to go to my room. I saw my dad leaving the kitchen on the other side, going the same direction as me down the hall. He was just ahead of me. My parents' room was down the hall, just like mine, right next door. I assumed he was going into his room and didn't think anything of it. Didn't say anything, didn't see his face, just assumed that he was going to take a nap or something. But instead of walking straight into his room, he turned left, where the only way he could go was into my room. I assumed that he was looking for me. Again, didn't think much of it. I was right behind him. But when I turned into my room after him, he was just gone. But I saw him, though, clear as day, as solid as me. It definitely wasn't something in my peripheral or a shadow. That was my dad. Obviously, I got scared. I ran into the den where he was last at. But there he was, falling asleep to the football game. I woke him and asked if he'd been in my room, and he said no, of course. But if he had been in my room like I saw, then he'd have needed to turn back down the hall, past me, and go through the kitchen again to get to the den. This always stuck with me for two reasons as well. One, because I couldn't quite explain how there could have been two of the same person in the same house. And two, because of the fact that I never actually saw his face, and it just kind of gave me a sinking feeling. 15 years later, and I still try to think of the possibilities. My first thought is that maybe it was something paranormal, as there were a few strange occurrences in that house. But I also think about the power source in the driveway. There was a big square vented area in our driveway, which I later learned was something from the energy company to power the entire neighborhood. And Maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe the house somehow recorded a memory and replayed it or something. I don't know. I'm clutching at straws here. It's probably not related to, but my dad, myself, and my sister, half of my family, all dream of our old home often. We dream that we're in it as if we truly are, and it's never been like that for any other home. My dad has the most vivid ones too, where he actually knows the new family is there and they can tell that somebody is in the house. We often joke that we haunt the house in our sleep, in fact. But I know that this isn't the first time that my dad has been involved in something like this. Across the country, in a different house years ago, my mum experienced hearing him come home, same exact routine that he's always had, just early. But when she called out for him and he didn't answer, she was so convinced that she'd heard someone come in, same keys, same footsteps, everything, that she actually searched the house with a weapon, terrified. I don't know if it's something to do with the house or something with my dad or some sort of a glitch in the Matrix. I don't know, but I really would like to find out. This story is from a while back, before I moved into my current home. In 2016, my mum and I moved into a very old home. Over the few years that we lived there, we had quite a few experiences, but the most notable for me personally was the incident of where I came face to face with the burned man upstairs. So it was a weeknight and I had school the next day. At around midnight, I went to bed, which was a bit early for me at that time. A few hours later, I woke up just drenched in sweat, and my fan was turned off. Annoyed, I rolled over to turn it back on and looked up at my door, noticing that it was open. And then the door opened a bit more, and a strange-looking nude man was standing before me. He seemed abnormally tall, I'd say at least 6'8", plus. His head was nearly touching the door frame for reference, and his skin just appeared off, similar to skin grafts that burn victims receive. It appeared visibly tacky and definitely wasn't very pleasant to look at, but its face was even worse. The skin on its mouth seemed to have been drawn back, exposing the gums fully, and one eye seemed far too small and the other far too large. Whatever it was, it just stood there in the doorway, looking at me. It smiled after it made eye contact with me, and to this day I can't tell you why I responded this way, but I get grumpy when I first wake up, and this was no exception. So I told this thing to get lost, and then I rolled over and fall back to sleep. I did this after turning my fan back on, of course. That morning, my door was still open, but nothing was there, and I went full panic mode and refused to sleep up there for weeks after it finally set in what I actually saw, which didn't help much. I have more stories from that house too, if anyone's interested. But some things to consider is that this home was actually once a funeral home, which had a fire a long time ago. I'm not sure if anyone was hurt or killed in this fire or not, but I always sleep with my door closed as well, and I remembered closing my door that night. It was a bit finicky, however, as there was no lock, and due to the house shifting, if you stepped on a certain floorboard, it would pop open. But I'm pretty sure that I would have noticed that. Also, at no point did I feel threatened during this encounter, despite its strange appearance. I'm not a hard-ass by any means, and I have a respectful fear of the paranormal for sure. Out of the other experiences in this house, this was the one time that I didn't feel scared or creeped out by a paranormal event, which is really strange because if anything should have scared me, it was probably that. I never talked about it the first time it happened as well, and nobody but my mum knew about it until now. My mum's friend and their little boy moved in as well, and despite nobody telling him about what I saw, he would wake up screaming in the dead of night about the tall man with the weird face, which only served to confirm everything that happened to me. So I'll preface this story by saying that I live in a small town in the Midwest of about maybe 300 people, basically in the middle of nowhere though. I can remember my mother telling a story too when I was younger that has stuck with me since. My father was an over-the-road truck driver, so he wasn't around much. That left my mother to pretty much raise my little brother, little sister, and me on her own. And one night she was awoken by a bright light shining through her bedroom window. She said that it was as if someone had parked their car and directly turned their bright headlights on, pointed toward her bedroom window. Her first instinct was to get up and check on us kids. She had noticed, though, that the bright light wasn't confined to her bedroom, as it was shining through every window in our house pretty much. And she saw that I was accounted for, as was my little sister, but she couldn't find my little brother, who was about 3 at the time. She was scouring the house and finally sees him in our laundry room, opening the back door that leads to our backyard. And as soon as he opens the door, the brilliant light shines in, and then she just remembers waking up. She's accepting this as all just a bit of a weird dream, when her eyes begin to focus on the dark of her bedroom, and she sees a small figure at the foot of her bed. As she sits up to see what exactly it is, it scampers off into the darkness of her house, and then she wakes up again. It's a dream in a dream. She keeps telling herself that anyway. And later that day, she's hanging up the laundry and conversing with our neighbor woman, who asks her a question. Hey, I know that this is going to sound like a really strange question, but did you guys have party lights on last night or something? No? Why? My mother replies. Our neighbor goes on to tell her that she and her husband had a disagreement the day before, and she decided to sleep in her son's room, and at about 3 a.m., she was woken up by a bright light emanating from around our house. Fast forward to a few years ago, and I own our old house and have children of my own. And to preface this next story, I should mention too that our house is set overlooking the town cemetery. Now, one evening after returning home, I'm carrying my youngest son into the house. I thought that he was asleep when all of a sudden he starts wailing and screaming while pointing across the graveyard. Daddy, get inside. They're coming after us. They're going to take us. The green skeleton men are going to take us. So this obviously freaks me out a bit, and I try to turn and see if there's anything that he's actually seeing. I don't see anything, but he just continues losing it. Once inside, he's still hysterical, wants me to lock the door and shut the shades. He absolutely refused to let me go out and get the groceries, and it was bizarre to say the least. Later that week, he has another spell. It's about 2 in the morning when I hear him crying and yelling for me. I rush into his room and he's crying, begging me not to let them take me again. I kind of write this off as a nightmare, but I ask him where they are trying to take him, and he replies with where the bad Power Rangers are. I proceed to ask him where the bad Power Rangers are, and he replies, a spaceship. Now, I don't know if it was just the imagination of a 4-year-old or if it was his mind trying to rationalize an actual traumatizing event. But I can't help but assume the two are connected. And it's the worst feeling in the world trying to protect your child from a monster that you don't even know may exist. Fast forward again, though, to this week. I started a paranormal conspiracy podcast earlier this year where we talk about creepy stuff and have listeners call in and experiences and such. And well, I got this email this week from the son of our neighbor that saw the light over our house that night. This is what it says. The incident involving AJ and I went like this. I know it was the early 90s because I was in my 70 Chevelle, somewhere between St. Mary's Church and where our shop is now. I was driving us home around 9 at night, no other traffic anywhere. Shortly before the highway curves left, the most intense bright white light appeared out of nowhere. It was like a flashlight being held against my eyes. Oddly enough, as blinding as it was, I could make out the outline of what I assumed was a man about my height. The first instinct was to jam on the brakes, and as soon as I did, the light was just gone. The car had died, and all the lights inside and outside weren't functioning. After a few seconds, the lights came on and the car started again, though. AJ wouldn't even answer me when I asked him what we hit. No damage, and I couldn't find anything anywhere. I drove to Mum and Dad's, and AJ begged me to not get out of the car. He never mentioned it on the highway, but now insisted that I stay in the car. I went in and got Mum and told her everything. She went to talk to AJ, and he told the same story, but refused to exit the car. He told her that whatever we saw was still hiding under the car somewhere. And my wife's question was, did this happen around the same time as the lights at your mum's house? And that was the end of the email. His incident took place no more than a mile or so from our house, and possibly the same or similar time as to the lights over the house incident, which is really weird. And so I can't help but think that they're all related, and I wonder about how our small town may have piqued something's interest so much like that. Do you guys have any idea about what might be going on here? So the year is 2007. I'm 9 years old and my brother is 7. Our parents are out working, our grandmother is out buying groceries, so we're left alone at our 3-story home. We're bored and quite energetic. We decided to play hide and seek. The family house is too big and too old, so we have plenty of space to play around and have fun with. And after a few rounds of playing, the turn to seek is mine and my brother has to hide. Counting up to 10 against the wall, I shout out, "Ready or not, here I come," and begin my search. Despite both of us being somewhat good at choosing difficult and creative places to hide in, my brother went for the most obvious spot that I could imagine, on the first floor, behind a curtain and against a wide window, where light reflected his body, his silhouette giving him away at first sight, and his tennis shoes showing at the base of the curtain. Victoriously, I tell him, "Come on, that's a really easy spot. It's your turn to seek." He doesn't move, and he doesn't answer, so I get upstairs and wait for him to come, sitting on a sofa against the wall with clear vision of the stairs. After a good 20 minutes or so, though, I see my brother come down from the 3rd floor. Confused, he asks me, "Why didn't you come to seek me?" I stay silent for a moment, and I ask him, "Did you put your runners at the base of the curtain?" He answers firmly, "No." He tells me that he heard me talking from the 3rd floor and assumed that Grandma arrived home and I was talking to her or something, which definitely was not the case. I tell him that I thought that he was behind the 1st floor curtain, and I ask him to come with me to the curtain to investigate. Slowly, we descend the stairs one by one, always keeping our backs to the wall and our eyes on the bottom of the stairs. And when the curtain is within our vision, there's no figure there anymore, but the shoes are still there, still at the base. Closing in, I reach out with my hand to the curtain, but there's just air. I keep pulling the enormous curtain to try and feel something, but an earwig falls from it and lands on my shoulder. Scared, I slap it away and step back. Both of us go upstairs quickly, and I tell my brother what I saw. He reaffirms to me that he definitely didn't put the shoes there and that we should stay put on the sofa until Grandma arrives, so we did. Up to this day, I still don't know what I saw back then. Since 3.5 years ago, we moved out of the home because of financial problems, and we never experienced something similar ever again. I always took my brother's word as the truth, since the last round before he hid, I was the one to hide, and I don't remember seeing the shoes on the 1st floor when I did. There's no way that he could have gone from his room in the back of the 2nd floor to the 1st floor, and then the 3rd floor in just 10 seconds without me hearing him run to put the shoes there. Plus, why would he do that? Perhaps my memories are blurry, and perhaps my brother did lie and somehow pulled it off. I don't know. Or maybe someone or something really manifested then and there. Maybe it just wanted to play with us. Maybe their motives were sinister. I don't know. But whatever it was, I still keep it as a memory from the house that I grew in. And I still wonder exactly what played hide and seek with us all those years ago. Last summer, me and my brother took a walk through the woods at Silver Falls State Park in Oregon. The forests were beautiful and cool, so we figured why not, and we took a path into the trees. We were pretty far down the path when it happened. Our cabins were far out of view and out of earshot, and we had just turned a corner and began going up the side of a cliff when my brother froze. I asked him what was wrong, and he was near tears, and he told me that he wanted to go back. We jogged back to the cabins, and he told me that he saw a black streak that was the shape of a human, with a long nose, a bald head, skinny limbs, dashing silently through the trees. I've never seen my brother in this state before. I mean, he was crying and shaking. I've been thinking about it, and could it have been some sort of a cryptid or something? Maybe whatever that was, if it wasn't just my brother's imagination, is what snatches up people in the blink of an eye in missing 411 cases. I don't know. I would love to hear any ideas or similar experiences for sure. Thanks. So about 2 months ago, I got hired to work in a gas station, or a convenience store, same thing to me. But it wasn't a hard job, but the challenge was being open 24 hours. I worked the night shift, often alone, starting around 10 p.m. and leaving shortly after 6 a.m. At night, I met a very wide range of people too, passing through or regular customers. And now, don't get me wrong, it's a big gas station and we do have food that we make in the small back kitchen, if it isn't already made and packaged to be out, which it usually was. But still, there was a lot of different people. So I start to prepare the breakfast foods from around 3 a.m. because we had a morning rush of people at around 4:30, every day like clockwork as well. I don't usually get all superstitious about the certain times of night and all that, and preparing breakfast foods this early had become a bit of a routine by this point. I remember this whole night just feeling off. I don't know why, but routine just didn't feel, well, routine. Anyway, I get things ready and prepped for breakfast, seeing as I had no one in the gas station. We kept anything already made or packaged in the freezer, just before all of the cold beverage crates. But this door is completely metal, which a handle is on the outside and a push button inside to get out. This freezer is also isolated in the back, so I'm aware of anything going on outside of it. When you open the door, it's a clear path where it swings open, and it'll stay open for the most part. If it does close, it doesn't close fully, leaving a decent gap open, which was also normal. To actually close it, you have to push on it from the outside or pull it from the inside. And so I'm in this freezer getting what I need, and I see the door move slightly. But in a matter of seconds, after turning back to my task, this huge door slams shut, and I mean with a massive force. It was like someone threw their whole body against this door, and I couldn't even slam it that hard if I tried to. I didn't have time to process, and the fact that I jumped so badly, I dropped all of the food before I swung the door open, and I ran out to the open station. My immediate thought was that someone had come in, walked into the back office, like with bad intentions or something, and saw that I was in the freezer. When I told my co-worker that morning, we checked the cameras that are scattered around the station, and matched the time that it happened because we don't have one that points at the freezer door or anything. But she could tell that I wasn't joking because I was quite visibly shaken up. Sure enough, aside from me, the place was completely void of people. I was scared so badly by this that I actually stopped doing night shifts at that location, and have since been transferred to a smaller gas station that closes at midnight. I really can't explain what happened that night, but I haven't been the same about working alone since then. Now, I know that this is a strange one, but I decided to tell this story to see if anyone has any sort of rational explanation. I'm 50, male from Peru, and when I was young, my family, 2 sisters, mother and father, used to live in a house in a rural village next door to my uncle. We all slept in the same room, separate beds, and we didn't have electricity. Also, there was only one door to the bedroom and one window, which we kept closed at night. So one night, I woke up to the sound of my sister screaming. She was shouting that somebody was in her room and touching her thigh. My dad got up and lit a candle, but there was no one in the room. The doors and the windows were closed, and he said that she must have been dreaming, so we all just went back to bed and went back to sleep. The following night, the same incident again. My sister wakes up screaming, saying that someone was moving their hand slowly up her thigh. Dad lights the candle, and there's no one there. The following night, my other sister, number 2, sleeps in her bed with sister 1. Sister 2 wakes up screaming that someone is touching her thigh. Dad checks the room with a candle again, and again there's nothing. This is when we all start to get a little bit concerned, but my parents think my sisters are just playing a very weird joke. The following night, my mother sleeps in my sister's bed, and my sisters sleep with my dad. In the middle of the night, my mum wakes up screaming that someone was indeed touching her thigh. And now my parents are super freaked out. But once again, there was nothing in the room and all the doors and the windows were closed. My dad asks everyone to leave the house and stay with my uncle next door, and he decides to sleep in my sister's bed in the house alone. And this is where things get really weird and really unexplainable to me. So that night, we wake up to the sounds of my dad shouting for my uncle to help him. My uncle runs next door, lights a candle, and finds my dad lying on the floor out of breath with red marks on his chest and face. And this is my dad's story about what happened. So he said that he was sleeping when he woke up in the night to find a hand touching his thigh, but he didn't react immediately. He waited, and the hand began to move higher and higher up his thigh towards his genitals, and as the hand got very close, he grabbed it, and he says that he grabbed onto a really hairy arm, too hairy to be human. He held onto the creature as long as he could. He said that it was really large and strong, but it scratched him lightly during the struggle, and he couldn't hold on. But the creature didn't run away or open a door or a window or anything. But there was just silence after that, and I saw the redness on my dad, and I actually believe the story because he's not the type of guy to just make something up like this. I was the only one to never experience anything, and to be honest, I'm kind of thankful. After this incident, my dad and uncle stayed in the house, but the creature, or whatever it was, never came back. We all returned to sleeping in that room eventually, and we never had another issue. But do any of you guys have any idea of what it could have been? The area is not known for monkeys, certainly not large ones anyway, and I don't know how a monkey could have entered the room every night and then left with no noise. But that's the most likely explanation that I can think of. I mean, there's just no way to enter the room except through a closed door or a closed locked window, which obviously just makes no sense. So around 10 or 11 this morning, I was about to go for a run, but beforehand, I was just chilling in the kitchen. I'd already been up for a couple of hours at this point, had breakfast, etc., etc. When out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention. When I looked over at it, it seemed that somebody with long blonde hair just moved out of view of the window. I tried to look around the corner from both windows that I could look out of, and saw nothing. I thought nothing of it. Could have been my cat or something, but then again it seemed like a different colour, and it looked more like a head of hair and not a cat. A few minutes later, a couple of my cats were waiting outside a different window, but were looking straight at the corner of the house where I saw this blonde thing move to. I caught the cat's attention, but then they looked right back there, which was strange, but oh well, I just carried on and went for my run. When I got back, my sisters wanted to chat, and they said to me, "Hey, do you know what happened with Dad last night?" I said no, and they proceeded to tell me that something freaked him out a bit considering what happened that morning. They told me that my dad came into their room at around 11 and asked them, "Hey, did you guys bring another girl with?" They'd been out at a music event. After my sisters said no, my dad went as white as milk apparently. He told them that when my two sisters came up the stairs, he saw a third girl follow them up the stairs, a few steps behind them. They both went into their separate rooms, and the third girl paused at the top of the stairs and then proceeded to go into my sister's room. My dad was confused at first, but thought it could have just been one of my sister's friends, as they usually have some over after these events. But no, it was actually nobody. And the weird thing is that this third girl was also blonde, like the thing that I saw briefly go past my window this morning. Now, I had not known about what my dad saw, and neither did he know what I saw. My other sister then comes out and says that a few weeks ago, she thought that she saw a blonde girl go across the landing at the top of the stairs outside my parents' bedroom, but as she just woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, she just thought that she was being all weird and stuff. Anyway, our family obviously thinks that this is some really spooky stuff, but do you guys have any suggestions on what we might need to do next? When I was probably 13, my family and I were on our way home from a Wednesday night church service. My mum was in the driver's seat and I was behind her in the back. My 5-year-old brother was in the middle and my 10-year-old sister was on the other side. We were just down the road from the church, but it was a country road and late, so there was no light and no one else on the road. We were just coming up to our turn when, all of a sudden, a car comes swerving from our turning point. This little car was taking the turn so fast that they came into our lane and almost even hit us. We swerved as they tried to get into their own lane before we collided, and unfortunately for them, they overcorrected and their car flipped and landed on the driver's side door in the ditch. My mum, of course, hits the brakes and immediately jumps out of the car to go and help whoever was in the car. She got about 3 steps away from the car and stopped dead in her tracks. But my sister and I are sitting there with our mouths hanging wide open, having no clue what to do. All I could think is, this isn't actually happening to us, right? This kind of stuff only happens in movies. But why isn't my mum going to help the person? It was summer too, so we had all of our windows halfway down, and I heard a person start yelling help from the car, and my mum starts moving again to help him. But for some reason, she stops again in the center of the road. Another car flies from behind us, and the guy doesn't hesitate to jump out and run up to the car to help. The man gets to the car and starts prying the passenger door open so the guy in the car can get out. I see my mum wants to run and help, but it's like she just can't move from that spot. The Good Samaritan that pulled up behind us is able to get the door popped open. The guy from inside crawls out the door and gets into like a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. At this point, my mum starts taking shuffle steps back to the car. When I look back at the guy, he has this crazy look on his face. He looks directly at our car and my mum and launches himself off the top of the car and hits the guy who was helping him. He starts running for our car at the same time that my mum turns and runs for our car, and he must have knew that he couldn't get to our car before my mum did because he changed directions and moved to the car behind us. My mum jumps in and locks our car doors just as the guy jumps in the empty driver's seat of the car behind us. He slams on the gas before he even has time to close the door and almost hits our car, taking off a second time. Next thing we know, the guy who was just carjacked runs up to my mum's window and starts screaming and knocking on the window. My mum is of course shaken and doesn't want to roll down the window, so she settles for cracking it so we can understand what he's saying. He's yelling, asking us to call 911 because his phone was in the car, along with his girlfriend. So, of course, my mum starts searching for a phone to call, but because she's so frantic from what just happened, she can't seem to find it. So, I take a break from keeping my little brother and sister calm and I dial 911 on my phone and I hand it to her. While she's explaining what happened to the operator, we hear a woman scream down the road. The man that was at our window takes off running, and a few minutes later comes back with a severely scraped up woman in his arms that turned out to be his girlfriend. My mum unlocks the doors at this point, and he sets her in the passenger seat while we wait for the cops. The girlfriend told us that he noticed her while he was speeding off and tried to hit her, but she scratched and punched at him, and while trying to plead with him to stop the car. He kept coming at her though and finally rolled down the window and just pushed her straight out, going about 60. The cops finally show up and talk to all of us and get our stories and whatnot. And while talking to one of the officers, he told my mum that the man had shot and killed a man behind some apartment complex, and that's why he was driving so fast and trying to get away. When we finally got home, we were all told to just go to bed, but of course I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. So I went downstairs to talk to my mum eventually, and I worked up the courage to ask her why she stopped running to the car when the other guy did it. And she told me that she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us that it was almost like she could hear it. When she heard him start yelling again, she ran to help again, but Just like last time, she got the overwhelming feeling just to not go near the car. To this day, I often wonder what would have happened if my mum hadn't have listened to that feeling. The guy could have easily overpowered her and got into our car if she had been any further away, and I shudder to think what would have happened to me and my younger siblings. This is a story that my ex-sister-in-law told me a few years ago. I've known her for 17 years now. At the time, it was 14, and it was the first time that she'd ever told me this story. So my sister-in-law moved to Provo, Utah in 2001 from Brazil. She'd only been living here for a little over a year when this took place in November of 2002. As she puts it, she was still getting used to the American culture and customs, and as such was still a little bit naive. She promises that this is something that she'll never do again, though. But here's her story in her own words. So, it was a snowy night in November back in 2002, and I was driving home late from work one night. I drive slower than most, even in the best weather conditions, because high speeds give me anxiety. I only take the freeway if I absolutely have to, but I stick with regular as much as possible, just like I was this night. I was taking my time as I drove home in quite the snowstorm. I came to stop and I noticed a man with crutches walking along the side of the road. I felt bad for him and I decided to pull over and give him a ride, which of course he accepted. I wasn't scared or nervous at all to offer this stranger a ride because, after all, this is Provo and I'm from Rio de Janeiro. I felt very confident in my street smarts, especially in smaller cities like this. So we started with just small talk, which was pleasant, and that evolved into a lengthy conversation. As the conversation progressed, he began to ask me some questions about myself, including what I did for a living, and I told him I was just working at a local pizza joint at the time and going to school studying English, and in turn asked him what he did for a living and what he was going to do on the side of the road in the middle of a snowstorm like that. And he told me that he'd just been released from prison and was going to his friend's house. When he arrived, he found out his friend no longer lived there, and he was just wandering around because he didn't know where to go. It's important to note too that from the moment that he entered my car, I had a very uneasy feeling and was instantly second-guessing my decision. At one point, he went to grab something out of a bag that he was carrying, and I honestly thought, well, this is how I'm going to die. It ended up being nothing, but I was scared the whole time, even if I wasn't showing it. Now, you're probably wondering what his answer was for what he did for a living, right? Well, what he said after I asked this question chilled me to the bone, because he simply told me this: I end people's lives. He then proceeded to give me some very sound advice, and he said, listen to me, you're a good person, but what you did for me today, I don't want you to ever do that again. It's dangerous. There are a lot of bad people out there, and today was your lucky day. And with that, he asked me to pull over the car, got out, and we just went our separate ways. I had goosebumps the entire time that she was telling me this story, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and I'm very thankful that she hasn't done that ever again. Back in 2010, I lived in a real dive of a place with 4 other guys. It was a triplex. The owner had converted it into one house, and the place was honestly just short of being condemned, but we were all in our 20s and wanted a party house, so it really worked for us. But we threw so many parties that we just didn't notice a lot of the stuff, and like when the spare bedroom window was smashed, and we assumed one of our drunk friends did it by accident. Anytime food went missing, well, obviously one of our drunk idiot roommates just stole it, even though no one ever fessed up to it. But we also had a ridiculous problem with what we assumed were raccoons. All the damn time we would hear scratching and shuffling up on the roof, and every morning we would go out and our trash would be just all over the place. Well, after about a year of just random messes, missing food and alcohol, and these eerie scratches, one of my roommates and I were leaving the house at the same time for work. As we step outside, There's a familiar woman in our front yard, and we've seen her a few times, just wandering the streets in the neighborhood, but never really paid her any attention. But this time, she's wearing one of my t-shirts and going through our trash can, tossing things on the ground that she isn't interested in, and my roommate and I just kind of both freeze as we see this woman doing this. And she very slowly looks up at us. Her eyes are totally glazed over, and she stares at us with confusion all over her face. My eyes go wide as I recognize my t-shirt, and I go to open my mouth when she says something that, to this day, has made me shudder. She says, "Why are you living in my house?" And that was all I could handle. I assure you that I'm not someone that is ever short on words, but this one rendered me entirely speechless. My roommate and I stared at each other eyes wide, got into our cars and drove the hell away from our own home, just to get away from that situation. That night, when we had all the boys together, we told them what had happened, and we made the decision to finally investigate the roof. Turns out, we had a flat roof. It's not generally the kind of thing that you think about. Most roofs are slanted or have angles and whatnot, but not our one. It was just a flat roof like a